Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome back to another read along with me. So we are still reading Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. We are on chapter 10. It is called Mayhem at the Ministry. Mr. Weasley woke them after only a few hours' sleep. He used magic to pack up the tent, and they left the campsite as quickly as possible, passing Mr. Roberts at the door of his cottage. Mr. Roberts had a strange, dazed look about him, and he waved them off with a vague "Merry Christmas." "He'll be all right," said Mr. Weasley quietly as they marched off onto the moor. "Sometimes when a person's memory is modified, it makes him a bit disoriented for a while, and that was a big thing they had to make him forget." They heard urgent voices as they approached the spot where the Portkeys lay, and when they reached it, they found a great number of witches and wizards gathered around Basil, the keeper of the Portkeys, all clamoring to get away from the campsite as quickly as possible. Mr. Weasley had a hurried discussion with Basil. They joined the queue and were able to take an old rubber tire back to Stout's Head Hill before the sun had really risen. They walked back through Ottery St. Catchpole and up the damp lane toward the Burrow in the dawnlight, talking very little because they were so exhausted, and thinking longingly of the breakfast. As they rounded the corner and the Burrow came into view, a cry echoed along the lane. "Oh, thank goodness! Thank goodness!" Mrs. Weasley, who had evidently been waiting for them in the front yard, came running toward them, still wearing her bedroom slippers, her face pale and strained, a rolled-up copy of the Daily Prophet clutched in her hand. "Arthur, I've been so worried, so worried!" She flung her arms around Mr. Weasley's neck, and the Daily Prophet fell out of her limp hand onto the ground. Looking down, Harry saw the headline, "Scenes of Terror at the Quidditch World Cup," complete with a twinkling black and white photograph of the dark mark over the treetops. "You're all right," Mrs. Weasley muttered distractedly, releasing Mr. Weasley and staring around at them all with red eyes. "You're alive. Oh, boys." And to everybody's surprise, she seized Fred and George and pulled them both into such a tight hug that their heads banged together. "Ouch! Mum, you're strangling us. I shouted at you before you left," Mrs. Weasley said, starting to sob. "It's all I've been thinking about. What if you know who had got you, and the last thing I ever said to you is that you didn't get enough OWLs? Oh, Fred, George, come on. Now, Molly, we're all perfectly okay," said Mr. Weasley soothingly, prizing her off the twins and leading her back toward the house. "Bill," he added in an undertone, "pick up that paper. I want to see what it says." When they all crammed into the tiny kitchen and Hermione had made Mrs. Weasley a cup of very strong tea, into which Mr. Weasley insisted on pouring a shot of Ogden's Old Fire whiskey, Bill handed his father the newspaper. Mr. Weasley scanned the front page while Percy looked over his shoulder. "I knew it," said Mr. Weasley heavily. "Ministry blunders, culprits not apprehended, lax security, dark wizards running unchecked, national disgrace. Who wrote this? Ah, of course, Rita Skeeter." "That woman's got it in for the Ministry of Magic," said Percy furiously. "Last week she was saying we're wasting our time quibbling about cauldron thickness when we should be stamping out vampires, as if it wasn't specifically stated in paragraph 12 of the guidelines for the treatment of non-wizard part humans." "Do us a favor, Perce," said Bill, yawning, "and shut up." "I'm mentioned," said Mr. Weasley, his eyes widening behind his glasses as he reached the bottom of the Daily Prophet article. "Where?" spluttered Mrs. Weasley, choking on her tea and whiskey. "If I'd seen that, I'd have known you were alive." "Not by my name," said Mr. Weasley. "Listen to this. If the terrified wizards and witches, who waited breathlessly for news at the edge of the wood, expected reassurance from the Ministry of Magic, they were sadly disappointed. A ministry official emerged from some time after the appearance of the dark mark, alleging that nobody had been hurt, but refusing to give any more information. Whether this statement will be enough to squash the rumors that several bodies were removed from the woods an hour later remains to be seen." "Oh, really?" said Mr. Weasley, in exasperation, handing the paper to Percy. "Nobody was hurt. What was I supposed to say? Rumors that several bodies were removed from the woods? Well, there certainly will be rumors now she's printed that." He heaved a deep sigh. "Molly, I'm going to have to go into the office. This is going to take some smoothing over." "I'll come with you, Father," said Percy importantly. "Mr. Crouch will need all hands on deck, and I can give him my cauldron report in person." He's still yapping about them damn cauldrons. Nobody cares about them damn cauldrons, but he's still yammering on about it. Hold on, I just got a phone call. I don't have my Fitbit on today. Oh, it was an unknown. Okay. Yeah, I don't have my Fitbit on today. My Fitbit is charging. Usually I get my notifications and stuff through my Fitbit. I started putting my phone off to the side somewhere so the ringer doesn't go off and stuff, because that's been bugging me lately. But usually I have a Fitbit, and my phone was just vibrating over here. I heard it, and it's just a scam caller. But anyways, back to our book. He bustled out of the kitchen. Mrs. Weasley looked most upset. Arthur, you're supposed to be on holiday. This hasn't got anything to do with your office. Surely they can handle this without you. I've got to go, Molly, said Mr. Weasley. I've made things worse. I'll just change into my robes and I'll be off. Mrs. Weasley, said Harry suddenly, unable to contain himself, Hedwig hasn't arrived with a letter for me, has she? Hedwig, dear? Said Mrs. Weasley distractedly. No, there hasn't been any post at all. Ron and Hermione looked curiously at Harry. With a meaningful look at both of them, he said, All right if I go and dump my stuff in your room, Ron. Yeah, think I will too, said Ron at once. Hermione. Yes, she said quickly, and the three of them marched out of the kitchen and up the stairs. What's up, Harry? Said Ron the moment they had closed the door of the attic room behind them. There's something I haven't told you, Harry said. On Saturday morning, I woke up with my scar hurting again. Ron's and Hermione's reactions were almost exactly as Harry had imagined them. Back in his bedroom on Privet Drive, Hermione gasped and started making suggestions at once, mentioning a number of reference books and everybody from Albus Dumbledore to Madame Pomfrey, the Hogwarts nurse. Ron simply looked dumbstruck. But he wasn't there, was he? You know who? I mean, last time your scar kept hurting, he was at Hogwarts, wasn't he? I'm sure he wasn't on Privet Drive, said Harry, but I was dreaming about him. Him and Peter. You know, Wormtail? I can't remember all of it now, but they were plotting to kill someone. He had teetered for a moment on the verge of saying me, but couldn't bring himself to make Hermione look any more horrified than she already did. It was only a dream, said Ron bracingly. Just a nightmare. Yeah, but was it, though? Said Harry, turning to look out of the window at the brightening sky. It's weird, isn't it? My scar hurts, and 3 days later the Death Eaters are on the march, and Voldemort's signs up in the sky again. Don't say his name, Ron hissed through gritted teeth. And remember what Professor Trelawney said, Harry went on, ignoring Ron, at the end of last year. Professor Trelawney was their divination teacher at Hogwarts. Hermione's terrified look vanished as she let out a derisive snort. Oh, Harry, you aren't going to pay attention to anything that old fraud says. You weren't there, said Harry. You didn't hear her. This time was different. I told you she went into a trance, a real one, and she said the Dark Lord would rise again, greater and more terrible than ever before. And he'd manage it because his servant was going to go back to him, and that night Wormtail escaped. There was a silence in which Ron fidgeted absent-mindedly with a hole in his Chudley Cannon's bedspread. Why were you asking if Hedwig had come, Harry? Hermione asked. Are you expecting a letter? I told Sirius about my scar, said Harry, shrugging. I'm waiting for his answer. Good thinking, said Ron, his expression clearing. I bet Sirius will know what to do. I hoped he'd get back for me quickly, said Harry. But we don't know where Sirius is. He could be in Africa or somewhere, couldn't he? Said Hermione reasonably. Hedwig's not going to manage that journey in a few days. Yeah, I know, said Harry, but there was a leaden feeling in his stomach as he looked out of the window at the Hedwig-free sky. Come and have a game of Quidditch in the orchard, Harry, said Ron. Come on, 3 on 3. Bill and Charlie and Fred and George will play. You can try out the Wronski feint. Ron, said Hermione, in an I don't think you're being very sensitive sort of voice, Harry doesn't want to play Quidditch right now. He's worried and he's tired. We all need to go to bed. Yeah, I want to play Quidditch, said Harry suddenly. Hang on, I'll get my fireball. Hermione left the room, muttering something that sounded very much like boys. Neither Mr. Weasley nor Percy was at home much over the following week, but left the house each morning before the rest of the family got up and returned well after dinner every night. It's been an absolute uproar, Percy told them importantly. The Sunday evening before they were due to return to Hogwarts, I've been putting out fires all week. People keep sending howlers, and of course, if you don't open a howler straight away, it explodes. Scorch marks all over my desk and my best quill reduced to cinders. Why are they all sending howlers? Asked Ginny, who was mending her copy of 1,000 Magical Herbs and Fungi with spell tape on the rug in front of the living room fire. Complaining about security at the World Cup, said Percy. They want compensation for their ruined property. Mundungus Fletcher's in a claim for a 12-bedroom tent with an in-suite jacuzzi, but I've got his number. I know for a fact he was sleeping under a cloak propped on stakes. Mrs. Weasley glanced at the grandfather clock in the corner. Harry liked this clock. It was completely useless if you wanted to know the time, but otherwise very informative. It had 9 golden hands, and each of them was engraved with one of the Weasley family's name. There were no numerals around the face, but descriptions of where each family member might be. Home, school, and work were there, but there was also traveling, lost, hospital, prison, and in the position where the number 12 would be on a normal clock, mortal peril. 8 of the hands were currently pointing to the home position, but Mr. Weasley's, which was the longest, was still pointing to work. Mrs. Weasley sighed. Your father hasn't had to go into the office on weekends since the days of you-know-who, she said. They're working him far too hard. His dinner's going to be ruined if he doesn't come home soon. Well, father feels he's got to make up for his mistake at the match, doesn't he? Said Percy. If truth be told, he was a tad unwise to make a public statement without clearing it with his head of department first. Don't you dare blame your father for what that wretched Skeeter woman wrote, said Mrs. Weasley, flaring up at once. If Dad hadn't said anything, old Rita would just have said it was disgraceful that nobody from the ministry had commented, said Bill, who was playing chess with Ron. Rita Skeeter never makes anyone look good. Remember, she interviewed all the Gringotts charm breakers once and called me a long-haired pillock. What? Well, it is a bit long, dear, said Mrs. Weasley gently. If you just let me. No, Mum. Rain lashed against the living room window. Hermione was immersed in the Standard Book of Spells, Grade 4, copies of which Mrs. Weasley had bought for her, Harry, and Ron in Diagon Alley. Charlie was darning a fireproof baklava. Harry was polishing his firebolt, the broomstick servicing kit Hermione had given him for his 13th birthday, open at his feet. Fred and George were sitting in a far corner, quills out, talking in whispers, their heads bent over a piece of parchment. What are you two up to? Said Mrs. Weasley sharply, her eyes on the twins. Homework? Said Fred vaguely. Don't be ridiculous. You're still on holiday, said Mrs. Weasley. Yeah, we've left it a bit late, said George. We're not by any chance writing out a new order form, are you? Said Mrs. Weasley shrewdly. You wouldn't be thinking of restarting Weasley's Wizard Wheezes by any chance. No, Mum, said Fred, looking up at her, a pained look on his face. If the Hogwarts Express crashed tomorrow and George and I died, how would you feel to know that the last thing we ever heard from you was an unfounded accusation? Everyone laughed, even Mrs. Weasley. Oh, your father's coming, she said, suddenly looking up at the clock again. Mr. Weasley's hand had suddenly spun from work to traveling. A second later, it had shuddered to a halt on home with the others, and they heard him calling from the kitchen. Coming, Arthur, called Mrs. Weasley, hurrying out of the room. A few moments later, Mr. Weasley came into the warm living room carrying his dinner on a tray. He looked completely exhausted. Well, the fat's really in the fire now, he told Mrs. Weasley as he sat down in an armchair near the hearth and toyed enthusiastically with his somewhat shriveled cauliflower. Rita Skeeter's been ferreting around all week looking for more ministry mess-ups to report, and now she's found out about poor old Bertha going missing. So that'll be the headline in the Prophet tomorrow. I told Bagman he should have sent someone to look for her ages ago. Mr. Crouch has been saying it for weeks and weeks, said Percy swiftly. Crouch is very lucky Rita hasn't found out about Winky, said Mr. Weasley irritably. There'd be a week's worth of headlines in his house elf being caught holding the wand that conjured the dark mark. I thought we were all agreed that elf, while irresponsible, did not conjure the mark, said Percy hotly. If you ask me, Mr. Crouch is very lucky no one at the Daily Prophet knows how mean he is to elves, said Hermione angrily. Now look here, Hermione, said Percy. A high-ranking ministry official like Mr. Crouch deserves unswerving obedience from his servants. His slave, you mean? Said Hermione, her voice rising passionately. Because he didn't pay Winky, did he? I think you'd all better go upstairs and check that you've packed properly, said Mrs. Weasley, breaking up the argument. Come on now, all of you. Harry repacked his broomstick servicing kit, put his firebolt over his shoulder, and went back upstairs with Ron. The rain sounded even louder at the top of the house, accompanied by loud whistlings and moans from the wind, not to mention sporadic howls from the ghoul who lived in the attic. Pidgewiggin began twittering and zooming around his cage when they entered. The sight of the half-packed trunks seemed to have sent him into a frenzy of excitement. Bung him some owl treats, said Ron, throwing a packet across to Harry. I might shut him up. Harry poked a few owl treats through the bars of Pidgewiggins' cage, then turned to his trunk. Hedwig's cage stood next to it, still empty. It's been over a week, Harry said, looking at Hedwig's deserted perch. Ron, you don't reckon Sirius has been caught, do you? Nah, it would have been in the Daily Prophet, said Ron. The ministry would want to show they'd caught someone, wouldn't they? Yeah, I suppose. Look, here's the stuff Mum got for you in Diagon Alley, and she's got some gold out of your vault for you, and she's washed all your socks. He heaved a pile of parcels onto Harry's camp bed and dropped the money bag and a load of socks next to him. Harry started unwrapping the shopping. Apart from the Standard Book of Spells Grade 4 by Miranda Goshawk, he had a handful of new quills, a dozen rolls of parchment, and refills for his potion-making kit. He had been running low on spine of lionfish and essence of belladonna. He was just piling underwear into his cauldron when Ron made a loud noise of disgust behind him. What is that supposed to be? He was holding up something that looked to Harry like a long maroon velvet dress. It had a moldy-looking lace frill at the collar and matching lace cuffs. There was a knock on the door, and Mrs. Weasley entered carrying an armful of freshly laundered Hogwarts robes. "Here you are," she said, sorting them into piles. "Now mind you pack them properly so they don't crease." "Mum, you've given me Ginny's new dress," said Ron, handing it out to her. "Of course I haven't," said Mrs. Weasley. "That's for you. Dress robes." "What?" said Ron, looking horror-struck. "Dress robes," repeated Mrs. Weasley. "It says on your school list that you're supposed to have dress robes this year. Robes for formal occasions." "You've got to be kidding," said Ron in disbelief. "I'm not wearing that. No way." "Everyone wears them, Ron," said Mrs. Weasley crossly. "They're all like that. Your father's got some for smart parties." "I'll go starkers before I put that on," said Ron stubbornly. "Don't be so silly," said Mrs. Weasley. "You've got to have dress robes. They're on your list. I got some for Harry, too. Show 'em, Harry." In some trepidation, Harry opened the last parcel on his camp bed. It wasn't as bad as he had expected. However, his dress robes didn't have any lace on them at all. In fact, they were more or less the same as his school ones, except that they were bottle green instead of black. "I thought they'd bring out the color of your eyes, dear," said Mrs. Weasley fondly. "Well, they're okay," said Ron angrily, looking at Harry's robes. "Why couldn't I have some like that?" "Because, well, I had to get yours second-hand, and there wasn't a lot of choice," said Mrs. Weasley, flushing. Harry looked away. He would willingly have split all the money in his Gringotts vault with the Weasleys, but he knew they would never take it. "I'm never wearing them," Ron was saying stubbornly. "Never." "Fine," snapped Mrs. Weasley. "Go naked. And, Harry, make sure you get a picture of him. Goodness knows I could do with a laugh." She left the room, slamming the door behind her. There was a funny spluttering noise from behind them. Pigwidgeon was choking on an overlarge owl treat. "Why is everything I own rubbish?" said Ron furiously, striding across the room to unstick Pigwidgeon's beak. Oh my god, say that 10 times fast. That is like impossible to say. Alright, Chapter 11. Aboard the Hogwarts Express. There was a definite end of the holidays gloom in the air when Harry awoke next morning. Heavy rain was still splattering against the window as he got dressed in jeans and a sweatshirt. They would change into their school robes on the Hogwarts Express. He, Ron, Fred, and George had just reached the first floor landing on their way down to breakfast when Mrs. Weasley appeared at the foot of the stairs looking harassed. "Arthur," she called up the staircase. "Arthur, urgent message from the Ministry." Harry flattened himself against the wall as Mr. Weasley came clattering past with his robes on back to front and hurtled out of the sight. When Harry and the others entered the kitchen, they saw Mrs. Weasley rummaging anxiously in the drawers. "I've got a quill here somewhere," and Mr. Weasley bending over the fire, talking too. Harry shut his eyes hard and opened them again to make sure that they were working properly. Amos Diggory's head was sitting in the middle of the flames like a large, bearded egg. It was talking very fast, completely unperturbed by the sparks flying around it and the flames licking its ears. Muggle neighbors heard bangs and shouting, so they went and called those, what do you call 'em, policemen? "Arthur, you've got to get over there." "Here," said Mrs. Weasley breathlessly, pushing a piece of parchment and a bottle of ink and a crumpled quill into Mr. Weasley's hands. "It's a real stroke of luck. I heard about it," said Mr. Diggory's head. "I had to come into the office early to send a couple of owls, and I found the improper use of Magic-a-Lot all setting off. If Rita Skeeter gets hold of this one, Arthur." "What does Mad Eye say happened?" asked Mr. Weasley, unscrewing the ink bottle, loading up his quill, and preparing to take notes. Mr. Diggory's head rolled its eyes. "Says he heard an intruder in his yard. Says he was creeping toward the house, but was ambushed by his dustbins." "What did the dustbins do?" asked Mr. Weasley, scribbling frantically. "Made one hell of a noise and fired rubbish everywhere, as far as I can tell," said Mr. Diggory. "Apparently one of them was still rocketing around when the policemen turned up." Mr. Weasley groaned. "And what about the intruder?" "Arthur, you know Mad Eye," said Mr. Diggory's head, rolling its eyes again. "Someone creeping into his yard in the dead of night. More likely there's a very shell-shocked cat wandering around somewhere covered in potato peelings. But if the improper use of Magic-a-Lot get their hands on Mad Eye, he's had it. Think of his record. We've got to get him off on a minor charge. It's something in your department. What are exploding dustbins worth?" "Might be a caution," said Mr. Weasley, still riding very fast, his brow furrowed. "Mad Eye didn't use his wand. He didn't actually attack anyone." "I'll bet he leapt out of bed and started jinxing everything he could reach through the window," said Mr. Diggory, "but they'll have a job proving it. There aren't any casualties." "All right, I'm off," Mr. Weasley said, and he stuffed the parchment with his notes on it into his pocket and dashed out of the kitchen again. Mr. Diggory's head looked around at Mrs. Weasley. "Sorry about this, Molly," it said more clearly, "bothering you so early and everything, but Arthur's the only one who can get Mad Eye off, and Mad Eye's supposed to be starting his new job today. Why, he had to choose last night." "Never mind, Amos," said Mrs. Weasley. "Sure you won't have a bit of toast or anything before you go?" "Oh, go on then," said Mr. Diggory. Mrs. Weasley took a piece of buttered toast from a stack on the kitchen table, put it into the fire tongs, and transferred it into Mr. Diggory's mouth. "Thanks," he said in a muffled voice, and then with a small pop, vanished. Harry could hear Mr. Weasley calling hurried goodbyes to Bill, Charlie, Percy, and the girls. Within 5 minutes he was back in the kitchen, his robes on the right way, dragging a comb through his hair. "I'd better hurry. You have a good turn, boys," said Mr. Weasley to Harry, Ron, and the twins, fastening a cloak over his shoulders and preparing to disapparate. "Molly, are you going to be all right taking the kids to King's Cross?" "Of course I will," she said. "You just look after Mad Eye. We'll be fine." As Mr. Weasley vanished, Bill and Charlie entered the kitchen. "Did someone say Mad Eye?" Bill asked. "What's he been up to now?" "He says someone tried to break into his house last night," said Mr. Weasley. "Mad Eye Moody?" said George thoughtfully, spreading marmalade on his toast. "Isn't he that nutter?" "Your father thinks very highly of Mad Eye Moody," said Mrs. Weasley sternly. "Yeah, well, Dad collects plugs, doesn't he?" said Fred quietly as Mrs. Weasley left the room. "Birds of a feather." "Moody was a great wizard in his time," said Bill. "He's an old friend of Dumbledore's, isn't he?" said Charlie. "Dumbledore's not what you'd call normal, though, is he?" said Fred. "I mean, I know he's a genius and everything." "Who is Mad Eye?" asked Harry. "He's retired. Used to work at the Ministry," said Charlie. "I met him once when Dad took me in to work with him. He was an Auror, one of the best, a dark wizard catcher," he added, seeing Harry's blank look. "Half the cells in Azkaban are full because of him. He made himself loads of enemies, though, the families of people he caught. Mainly, and I heard he's been getting really paranoid in his old age. Doesn't trust anyone anymore. Sees dark wizards everywhere." Bill and Charlie decided to come and see everyone off at King's Cross Station, but Percy, apologizing most profusely, said that he really needed to get to work. "I just can't justify taking more time off at the moment," he told them. "Mr. Crouch is really starting to rely on me." "Yeah, you know what, Percy?" said George seriously. "I reckon he'll know your name soon." Mrs. Weasley had braved the telephone in the village post office to order 3 ordinary Muggle taxis to take them into London. "Arthur tried to borrow Ministry cars for us," Mrs. Weasley whispered to Harry as they stood in the rain-washed yard, watching the taxi drivers heaving 6 heavy Hogwarts trunks into their cars, "but there weren't any spare. Oh dear, they don't look happy, do they?" Harry didn't like to tell Mrs. Weasley that Muggle taxi drivers rarely transported overexcited owls, and Pidgeotto was making an ear-splitting racket. Nor did it help that a number of filibusters' fabulous no-heat, wet-start fireworks went off unexpectedly when Fred's trunk sprang open, causing the driver carrying it to yell with fright and pain as Crookshanks clawed his way up the man's leg. The journey was uncomfortable, owing to the fact that they were jammed in the back of the taxis with their trunks. Crookshanks took quite a while to recover from the fireworks, and by the time they entered London, Harry, Ron, and Hermione were all severely scratched. They were very relieved to get out at King's Cross, even though the rain was coming down harder than ever, and they got soaked carrying their trunks across the busy road and into the station. Harry was used to getting onto platform 9 3/4 by now. It was a simple matter of walking straight through the apparently solid barrier dividing platforms 9 and 10. The only tricky part was doing this in an unobtrusive way, so as to avoid attracting Muggle attention. They did it in groups today. Harry, Ron, and Hermione, the most conspicuous, since they were accompanied by Pidgeotto and Crookshanks, went first, and they leaned casually against the barrier, chatting unconcernedly, and slid sideways through it, and as they did so, platform 9 3/4 materialized in front of them. The Hogwarts Express, a gleaming scarlet steam engine, was already there, clouds of steam billowing from it, through which many Hogwarts students and parents on the platform appeared like dark ghosts. Pidgeotto became noisier than ever in response to the hooting of many owls through the mist. Harry, Ron, and Hermione set off to find seats and were soon stowing their luggage in a compartment halfway along the train. They then hopped back down onto the platform to say goodbye to Mrs. Weasley, Bill, and Charlie. "I might be seeing you all sooner than you think," said Charlie, grinning as he hugged Ginny goodbye. "Why?" said Fred keenly. "You'll see," said Charlie. "Just don't tell Percy I mentioned it. It's classified information until such time as the Ministry sees fit to release it, after all." "Yeah, I sort of wish I were back at Hogwarts this year," said Bill, hands in his pockets, looking almost wistfully at the train. "Why?" said George impatiently. "You're going to have an interesting year," said Bill, his eyes twinkling. "I might even get time off to come and watch a bit of it." "A bit of what?" said Ron. But at that moment the whistle blew, and Mrs. Weasley chivied them toward the train doors. "Thanks for having us to stay, Mrs. Weasley," said Hermione as they climbed on board, closed the door, and leaned out of the window to talk to her. "Yeah, thanks for everything, Mrs. Weasley," said Harry. "Oh, it was my pleasure, dears," said Mrs. Weasley. "I'd invite you for Christmas, but, well, I expect you're all going to want to stay at Hogwarts, what with one thing and another." "Mum," said Ron irritably, "what do you three know that we don't?" "You'll find out this evening, I expect," said Mrs. Weasley, smiling. "It's going to be very exciting, mind you. I'm very glad they've changed the rules." "What rules?" said Harry, Ron, Fred, and George together. "I'm sure Professor Dumbledore will tell you. Now behave, won't you? Won't you, Fred? And you, George?" The pistons hissed loudly and the train began to move. "Tell us what's happening at Hogwarts," Fred bellowed out of the window as Mrs. Weasley, Bill, and Charlie sped away from them. "What rules are they changing?" But Mrs. Weasley only smiled and waved. Before the train had rounded the corner, she, Bill, and Charlie had disapparated. Harry, Ron, and Hermione went back to their compartment. The thick rain splattering the windows made it very difficult to see out of them. Ron undid his trunk, pulled out his maroon dress robes, and flung them over Pidgewagian's cage to muffle his hooting. "Bagman wanted to tell us what's happening at Hogwarts," he said grumpily, sitting down next to Harry. "At the World Cup, remember? But my own mother won't say. Wonder what?" "Shush," Hermione whispered suddenly, pressing her finger to her lips and pointing toward the compartment next to theirs. Harry and Ron listened and heard a familiar drawling voice drifting in through the open door. "Father actually considered sending me to Durmstrang rather than Hogwarts, you know. He knows the headmaster, you see. Well, you know his opinion of Dumbledore. The man's such a mudblood lover, and Durmstrang doesn't admit that sort of riffraff. But Mother didn't like the idea of me going to school so far away. Father says Durmstrang takes a far more sensible line than Hogwarts about the dark arts. Durmstrang students actually learn them, not just the defense rubbish we do." Hermione got up, tiptoed to the compartment door, and slid it shut, blocking out Malfoy's voice. "So he thinks Durmstrang would have suited him, does he?" she said angrily. "I wish he had gone. Then we wouldn't have to put up with them." "Durmstrang's another wizarding school," said Harry. "Yes," said Hermione sniffily, "and it's got a horrible reputation. According to an appraisal of magical education in Europe, it puts a lot of emphasis on the dark arts." "I think I've heard of it," said Ron vaguely. "Where is it? What country?" "Well, nobody knows, do they?" said Hermione, raising her eyebrows. "Oh, why not?" said Harry. "There's traditionally been a lot of rivalry between all the magic schools. Durmstrang and Box Batons like to conceal their whereabouts so nobody can steal their secrets," said Hermione matter-of-factly. "Come off it," said Ron, starting to laugh. "Durmstrang's got to be about the size as Hogwarts. How are you going to hide a great big castle?" "But Hogwarts is hidden," said Hermione in surprise. "Everyone knows that. Well, everyone who's read Hogwarts a history, anyway." "Just you, then," said Ron. "So go on. How'd you hide a place like Hogwarts?" "It's bewitched," said Hermione. "If a muggle looks at it, all they see is a moldering old ruin with a sign over the entrance saying, 'Danger, do not enter, unsafe.' So Durmstrang will just look like a ruin to an outsider, too." "Maybe," said Hermione, shrugging. "Or it might have muggle repelling charms on it, like the World Cup Stadium, and to keep foreign wizards from finding it, they'll have made it unplottable." "Come again?" "Well, you can enchant a building so it's impossible to plot on a map. Can't you?" If you say so," said Harry. "But I think Durmstrang must be somewhere in the far north," said Hermione thoughtfully. "Somewhere very cold, because they've got fur capes as part of their uniforms." "Ah, think of the possibilities," said Ron dreamily. "It would have been so easy to push Malfoy off a glacier and make it look like an accident. Shame his mother likes him." The rain became heavier and heavier as the train moved farther north. The sky was so dark and the windows so steamy that the lanterns were lit by midday. The lunch trolley came rattling along the corridor, and Harry bought a large sack of cauldron cakes for them to share. Several of their friends looked in on them as the afternoon progressed, including Seamus Finnegan, Dean Thomas, and Neville Longbottom, a round-faced, extremely forgetful boy who had been brought up by his formidable witch of a grandmother. "You know, every time we read these Harry Potter books and we get to Neville Longbottom, they explain the exact same thing about Neville every single time, like we forget. Like, how can you forget Neville? You can't forget Neville." Seamus was still wearing his Ireland rosette. Some of its magic seemed to be wearing off now. He was still squeaking, "Troy, Mullet, Moran," but in a very feeble and exhausted sort of way. After half an hour or so, Hermione, growing tired of the endless Quidditch talk, buried herself once more in the Standard Book of Spells, Grade 4, and started trying to learn a summoning charm. Neville listened jealously to the others' conversation as they relived the cup match. "Gran didn't want to go," he said miserably. "Wouldn't buy tickets. It sounded amazing, though." It was, said Ron. Look at this, Neville. He rummaged in his trunk up in the luggage rack and pulled out the miniature figure of Victor Crumb. Oh, wow, said Neville enviously as Ron tipped Crumb onto his pudgy hand. We saw him right up close as well, said Ron. We were in the top box. For the first and last time in your life, Weasley. Draco Malfoy had appeared in the doorway. Behind him stood Crabbe and Goyle, his enormous, thuggish cronies, both of whom appeared to have grown at least a foot during the summer. Evidently, they had overheard the conversation through the compartment door, which Dean and Seamus had left ajar. Don't remember asking you to join us, Malfoy, said Harry coolly. Weasley, what is that? Said Malfoy, pointing at Pidgeotgian's cage. A sleeve of Ron's dress robes, was dangling from it, swaying with the motion of the train, the moldy lace cuff from very obvious. Ron made to stuff the robes out of sight, but Malfoy was too quick for them. He seized the sleeve and pulled. Look at this, said Malfoy in ecstasy, holding up Ron's robes and showing Crabbe and Goyle. Weasley, you weren't thinking of wearing these, were you? I mean, they were very fashionable in about 1890. Eat dung, Malfoy, said Ron, the same color as the dress robes, as he snatched them back out of Malfoy's grip. Malfoy howled with derisive laughter. Crabbe and Goyle guffawed stupidly. So, going to enter, Weasley, going to try and bring a bit of glory to the family name. There's money involved as well, you know. You'll be able to afford some decent robes if you won. What are you talking about? Snapped Ron. Are you going to enter? Malfoy repeated. I suppose you will, Potter. You never miss a chance to show off, do you? Either explain what you're on about or go away, Malfoy, said Hermione testily over the top of the Standard Book of Spells, Grade 4. A gleeful smile spread across Malfoy's pale face. Don't tell me you don't know, he said delightedly. You've got a father and brother at the Ministry, and you don't even know? My God, my father told me about it ages ago. Heard it from Cornelius Fudge, but then father's always associated with the top people at the Ministry. Maybe your father's too junior to know about it, Weasley. Yes, they probably don't talk about important stuff in front of him. Laughing once more, Malfoy beckoned to Crabbe and Goyle, and the three of them disappeared. Ron got to his feet and slammed the sliding compartment door so hard behind them that the glass shattered. Ron, said Hermione reproachfully, and she pulled out her wand and muttered reparo, and the glass shards flew back into a single pane and back into the door. Well, making it look like he knows everything and we don't, Ron snarled. Father's always associated with the top people at the Ministry. Dad could have got a promotion any time. He just likes it where he is. Of course he does, said Hermione quietly. Don't let Malfoy get to you, Ron. Him? Get to me? As if, said Ron, picking up one of the remaining cauldron cakes and squishing it into a pulp. Ron's bad mood continued for the rest of the journey. He didn't talk much as they changed into their school robes and was still glowering when the Hogwarts Express slowed down at last and finally stopped in the pitch darkness of Hogsmeade Station. As the train doors opened, there was a rumble of thunder overhead. Hermione bundled up Crookshanks in her cloak, and Ron left his dress robes over Pidgeotgian as they left the train, heads bent and eyes narrowed against the downpour. The rain was now coming down so thick and fast that it was as though buckets of ice-cold water were being emptied repeatedly over their heads. Hi, Hagrid, Harry yelled, seeing a gigantic silhouette at the far end of the platform. All right, Harry, Hagrid bellowed back, waving. See you at the feast if we don't drown. First years traditionally reached Hogwarts Castle by sailing across the lake with Hagrid. Oh, I wouldn't fancy crossing the lake in this weather, said Hermione fervently, shivering as they inched slowly along the dark platform with the rest of the crowd. 100 horseless carriages stood waiting for them outside the station. Harry, Ron, Hermione, and Neville climbed gratefully into one of them. The doors shut with a snap, and a few moments later, with a great lurch, the long procession of carriages was rumbling and splashing its way up the track toward Hogwarts Castle. 1 second, let me get some water. Sorry, I had to go to the kitchen to get some water. Alright, guys. Chapter 12. The Tri-Wizard Tournament. Through the gates, flanked with statues of winged boars, and up the sweeping drive, the carriages trundled, swaying dangerously in what was fast becoming a gale. Leaning against the window, Harry could see Hogwarts coming near, its many lighted windows blurred and shimmering beyond the thick curtain of rain. Lightning flashed across the sky as their carriage came to a halt before the great oak front doors, which stood at the top of a flight of stone steps. People who had accompanied the carriages in front were already hurrying up the stone steps into the castle. Harry, Ron, Hermione, and Neville jumped down from their carriage and dashed up the steps too, looking up only when they were safely inside the cavernous, torch-lit entrance hall with its magnificent marble staircase. "Blimey," said Ron, shaking his head and sending water everywhere. "If that keeps up, the lake's going to overflow. I'm so... Ah!" A large, red, water-filled balloon had dropped from out of the ceiling onto Ron's head and exploded. Drenched and sputtering, Ron staggered sideways into Harry just as a second water bomb dropped. Narrowly missing Hermione, it burst at Harry's feet, sending a wave of cold water over his sneakers into his socks. People all around them shrieked and started pushing one another in their efforts to get out of the line of fire. Harry looked up and saw, floating 20 feet above them, Peeves the Poltergeist, a little man in a bell-covered hat and orange bow tie, his wide, malicious face contorted with concentration as he took aim again. "Peeves!" yelled an angry voice. "Peeves, come down here at once!" Professor McGonagall, deputy headmistress and head of Gryffindor House, had come dashing out of the great hall. She skidded on the wet floor and grabbed Hermione around the neck to stop herself from falling. "Ouch! Sorry, Miss Granger." "That's all right, Professor," Hermione gasped, massaging her throat. "Peeves, get down here now," barked Professor McGonagall, straightening her pointed hat and glaring upward through her square-rimmed spectacles. "Not doing nothing," cackled Peeves, lobbing a water bomb at several fifth-year girls who screamed and dived into the great hall. "Already wet, aren't they, little squirts? Whee!" And he aimed another bomb at a group of second-years who had just arrived. "I shall call the headmaster," shouted Professor McGonagall. "I'm warning you, Peeves." Peeves stuck out his tongue, threw the last of his water bombs into the air, and zoomed off up the marble staircase, cackling insanely. "Well, move along, then," said Professor McGonagall sharply to the bedraggled crowd. "Into the great hall. Come on." Harry, Ron, and Hermione slipped and slid across the entrance hall and through the double doors on the right, Ron muttering furiously under his breath as he pushed his sobbing hair off his face. The great hall looked its usual splendid self, decorated for the start of term feast. Golden plates and goblets gleamed by the light of hundreds and hundreds of candles floating over the tables in midair. The 4 long house tables were packed with chattering students. At the top of the hall, the staff sat along one side of a 5th table, placing their pupils. It was much warmer in here. Harry, Ron, and Hermione walked past the Slytherins, the Ravenclaws, and the Hufflepuffs, and sat down with the rest of the Gryffindors at the far side of the hall, next to Nearly Headless Nick, the Gryffindor ghost. Pearly white and semi-transparent, Nick was dressed tonight in his usual doublet, but with a particularly large ruff, which served the dual purpose of looking extra festive and ensuring that his head didn't wobble too much on his partially severed neck. "Good evening," he said, beaming at them. "Says who?" said Harry, taking off his sneakers and emptying them of water. "Hope they hurry up with the sorting. I'm starving." The sorting of the new students into houses took place at the start of every school year, but by an unlucky combination of circumstances, Harry hadn't been present at one since his own. He was quite looking forward to it. Just then, a highly excited, breathless voice called down the table, "Hiya, Harry!" It was Colin Creevey, a third year, to whom Harry was something of a hero. "Hi, Colin," said Harry wearily. "Harry, guess what? Guess what, Harry? My brother's starting. My brother Dennis." Good," said Harry. "He's really excited," said Colin, practically bouncing up and down in his seat. "I just hope he's in Gryffindor. Keep your fingers crossed, eh, Harry?" Yeah, all right," said Harry. He turned back to Hermione, Ron, and Nearly Headless Nick. "Brothers and sisters usually go in the same houses, don't they?" he said. He was judging by the Weasleys, all 7 of whom had been put into Gryffindor. "Oh, no, not necessarily," said Hermione. "Pavarti Patel's twins in Ravenclaw, and they're identical. You'd think they'd be together, wouldn't you?" Harry looked up at the staff table. There seemed to be rather more empty seats there than usual. Hagrid, of course, was still fighting his way across the lake with the first years. Professor McGonagall was presumably supervising the drying of the entrance hall floor, but there was another empty chair, too, and Harry couldn't think who else was missing. "Where's the new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher?" said Hermione, who was also looking up at the teachers. They had never yet had a Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher who had lasted more than 3 terms. Harry's favorite, by far, had been Professor Lupin, who had resigned last year. He looked up and down the staff table. There was definitely no new face there. Maybe they couldn't get anyone, said Hermione, looking anxious. Harry scanned the table more carefully. Tiny little Professor Flitwick, the charms teacher, was sitting on a large pile of cushions beside Professor Sprout, the herbology teacher, whose hat was askew over her flyaway gray hair. She was talking to Professor Sinistra of the astronomy department. On Professor Sinistra's other side was the sallow-faced, hook-nosed, greasy-haired potions master Snape, Harry's least favorite person at Hogwarts. Harry's loathing of Snape was matched only by Snape's hatred of him, a hatred which had, if possible, intensified last year when Harry had helped Sirius escape right under Snape's overlarge nose. Snape and Sirius had been enemies since their own school days. On Snape's other side was an empty seat, which Harry guessed was Professor McGonagall's. Next to it, and in the very center of the table, sat Professor Dumbledore, the headmaster, his sweeping silver hair and beard shining in candlelight, his magnificent deep green robes embroidered with many stars and moons. The tips of Dumbledore's long, thin fingers were together, and he was resting his chin upon them, staring up at the ceiling through his half-moon spectacles as though lost in thought. Harry glanced up at the ceiling, too. It was enchanted to look like the sky outside, and he had never seen it look this stormy. Black and purple clouds were swirling across it, and as another thunderclap sounded outside, a fork of lightning flashed across it. "Oh, hurry up!" Ron moaned beside Harry. "I could eat a hippogriff." The words were no sooner out of his mouth than the doors of the great hall opened and silence fell. Professor McGonagall was leading a long line of first years up to the top of the hall. If Harry, Ron, and Hermione were wet, it was nothing to how these first years looked. They appeared to have swum across the lake rather than sailed. All of them were shivering with a combination of cold and nerves as they filed along the staff table and came to a halt in a line facing the rest of the school. All of them except the smallest of the lot, a boy with mousy hair who was wrapped in what Harry recognized as Hagrid's moleskin overcoat. The coat was so big for him that it looked as though he were draped in a furry black circus tent. His small face protruded from over the collar, looking almost painfully excited. When he had lined up with his terrified-looking peers, he caught Colin Creevy's eyes, gave a double thumbs up, and mouthed, "I fell in the lake." He looked positively delighted about it. Professor McGonagall now placed a three-legged stool on the ground before the first years, and on top of it an extremely old, dirty, patched wizard's hat. The first years stared at it. So did everyone else. For a moment there was silence. Then a long tear near the brim opened wide like a mouth, and the hat broke into song. Here we go. 1,000 years or more ago, when I was newly sown, there lived 4 wizards of renown, whose names are still well known. Bold Gryffindor from Wild Moor, fair Ravenclaw from Glen, sweet Hufflepuff from Valley Broad, shrewd Slytherin from Fen. They shared a wish, a hope, a dream. They hatched a daring plan to educate young sorcerers. Thus Hogwarts School began. Now each of these 4 founders formed their own house, for each did value different virtues in the ones they had to teach. By Gryffindor the bravest were, prized for far beyond the rest. For Ravenclaw the cleverest would always be the best. For Hufflepuff hard workers were most worthy of admission, and power-hungry Slytherin loved those of great ambition. While still alive they did divide their favorites from the throng, yet how to pick the worthy ones when they were dead and gone? 'Twas Gryffindor who found the way, he whipped me off his head. The founders put some brains in me so I could choose instead. Now slip me snug about your ears, I've never yet been wrong. I'll have a look inside your head and tell where you belong. Their great hall rang with applause as the Sorting Hat finished. "That's not the song it sang when it sorted us," said Harry, clapping along with everyone else. Sings a different one every year," said Ron. "It's got to be a pretty boring life, hasn't it, being a hat? I suppose it spends all year making up the next one." Professor McGonagall was now unrolling a large scroll of parchment. "When I call out your name, you will put on the hat and sit on the stool," she told the first years. "When the hat announces your house, you will go and sit at the appropriate table." Ackerley Stewart, a boy, walked forward, visibly trembling from head to foot, picked up the sorting hat, put it on, and sat down on the stool. "Ravenclaw," shouted the hat. Stuart Ackerley took off the hat and hurried into his seat at the Ravenclaw table, where everyone was applauding him. Harry caught a glimpse of Cho, the Ravenclaw seeker, cheering Stuart Ackerley as he sat down. For a fleeting second, Harry had a strange desire to join the Ravenclaw table too. Baddock Malcolm, Slytherin. The table on the other side of the hall erupted with cheers. Harry could see Malfoy clapping as Baddock joined the Slytherins. Harry wondered whether Baddock knew that Slytherin House had turned out more dark witches and wizards than any other. Fred and George hissed Malcolm Baddock as he sat down. Brainston Eleanor, Hufflepuff. Caldwell Owen, Hufflepuff. Creevy Dennis. Tiny Dennis Creevy staggered forward, tripping over Hagrid's moleskin just as Hagrid himself sidled into the hall through a door behind the teacher's table. About twice as tall as a normal man, and at least 3 times as broad, Hagrid, with his long, wild, tangled black hair and beard, looked slightly alarming. A misleading impression, for Harry, Ron, and Hermione knew Hagrid to possess a very kind nature. He winked at them as he sat down at the end of the staff table and watched Dennis Creevey putting on the Sorting Hat. The rip at the brim opened wide. "Gryffindor!" the hat shouted. Hagrid clapped along with the Gryffindors as Dennis Creevey, beaming widely, took off the hat, placed it back on the stool, and hurried over to join his brother. "Colin, I fell in," he said shrilly, throwing himself into an empty seat. "It was brilliant, and something in the lake grabbed me and pushed me back in the boat." "Cool," said Colin just as excitedly. "It was probably the giant squid, Dennis." "Wow," said Dennis, as though nobody in their wildest dreams could hope for more than being thrown into a storm-tossed, fathoms-deep lake and pushed out of it again by a giant sea monster. "Dennis, Dennis, see that boy down there? The one with the black hair and glasses? See him? You know who he is, Dennis?" Harry looked away, staring very hard at the Sorting Hat now, sorting Emma Dobbs. The sorting continued, boys and girls with varying degrees of fright on their faces, moving one by one to the 3-legged stool, the line dwindling slowly as Professor McGonagall passed the L's. "Oh, hurry up," Ron moaned, massaging his stomach. "Now, Ron, the sorting's much more important than food," said Nearly Headless Nick, as Madly Laura became a Hufflepuff. "Course it is if you're dead," snapped Ron. "I do hope this year's batch of Gryffindors are up to scratch," said Nearly Headless Nick, applauding, as McDonald and Natalie joined the Gryffindor table. "We don't want to break our winning streak, do we?" Gryffindor had won the Inter-House Championship for the last 3 years in a row. Pritchard, Graham, Slytherin, Cork, Orla, Ravenclaw, and finally, with Whitby, Kevin, Hufflepuff, the sorting ended. Professor McGonagall picked up the hat and the stool and carried them away. "About time," said Ron, seizing his knife and fork and looking expectantly at his golden plate. "So you're telling me that out of all the students in there, only 2 of them went to Gryffindor? Everybody else went Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin?" Only 2 students, literally 2 students, got put in Gryffindor. "Okay. About time," said Ron, seizing his knife and fork and looking expectantly at his golden plate. Professor Dumbledore had gotten to his feet. He was smiling around at the students, his arms opened wide in welcome. "I have only 2 words to say to you," he told them, his deep voice echoing around the hall. "Tuck in." "Hear, hear," said Harry and Ron loudly as the empty dishes filled magically before their eyes. Nearly Headless Nick watched mournfully as Harry, Ron, and Hermione loaded their own plates. Let me see, hold on. That's better," said Ron with his mouth full of mashed potato. "You're lucky there's a feast at all tonight, you know," said Nearly Headless Nick. "There was trouble in the kitchens earlier." "Why, what happened?" said Harry through a sizable chunk of steak. "Peeves, of course," said Nearly Headless Nick, shaking his head, which wobbled dangerously. He pulled his ruff a little higher up on his neck. "The usual argument, you know. He wanted to attend the feast. Well, it's quite out of the question. You know what he's like, utterly uncivilized, can't see a plate of food without throwing it. We held a ghosts' council. The fat friar was all for giving him the chance, but most wisely, in my opinion, the Bloody Baron put his foot down. The Bloody Baron was a Slytherin ghost, a gaunt and silent spectre covered in silver bloodstains. He was the only person at Hogwarts who could really control Peeves." "Yeah, we thought Peeves seemed hacked off about something," said Ron darkly. "So what did he do in the kitchens?" "Oh, the usual," said Nearly Headless Nick, shrugging. "Wrecked havoc and mayhem. Pots and pans everywhere, place swimming in soup, terrified the house elves out of their wits." Clang! Hermione had knocked over her golden goblet. Pumpkin juice spread steadily over the tablecloth, staining several feet of white linen orange, but Hermione paid no attention. "There are house elves here?" she said, staring horror-struck at Nearly Headless Nick. "Here at Hogwarts?" "Certainly," said Nearly Headless Nick, looking surprised at her reaction. "The largest number in any dwelling in Britain, I believe. Over 100. "I've never seen one," said Hermione. "Well, they hardly ever leave the kitchen by day, do they?" said Nearly Headless Nick. "They come out at night to do a bit of cleaning, see to the fires, and so on. I mean, you're not supposed to see them, are you? That's the mark of a good house elf, isn't it? That you don't know it's there." Hermione stared at him. "But they get paid," she said. "They get holidays, don't they? And sick leave and pensions and everything." Nearly Headless Nick chortled so much that his riff slipped and his head flopped off, dangling on the inch or so of ghostly skin and muscle that still attached it to its neck. "Sick leave and pensions," he said, pushing his head back onto his shoulders and securing it once more with his ruff. "House elves don't want sick leave and pensions." Hermione looked down at her hardly touched plate of food, then put her knife and fork down upon it and pushed it away from her. "Oh, come on, Hermione," said Ron, accidentally spraying Harry with bits of Yorkshire pudding. Oops, sorry, Harry, he swallowed. You won't get them sick leave by starving yourself. Slave labor, said Hermione, breathing hard through her nose. That's what made this dinner. Slave labor. And she refused to eat another bite. The rain was still drumming heavily against the high dark glass. Another clap of thunder shook the windows, and the stormy ceiling flashed, illuminating the golden plates as the remains of the first course vanished and were replaced instantly with puddings. Treacle tart, Hermione, said Ron, deliberately wafting its smell toward her. Spotted Dick, look. Chocolate got two. What the fuck is Spotted Dick? I've never, in all my Hogwarts Harry Potter understanding of anything, have ever heard of Spotted Dick. The fuck is that? You know, I don't want to know. I don't want to know. It might be one of those weird magical fucking things, looks kind of creepy and shit. I don't want to know. I want to know, but I don't want to know. But Hermione gave him a look so reminiscent of Professor McGonagall that he gave up. When the puddings, too, had been demolished, and the last crumbs had faded off the plates, leaving them sparkling clean, Albus Dumbledore got to his feet again. The buzz of chatter filling the hall ceased almost at once, so that only the howling wind and pounding rain could be heard. So, said Dumbledore, smiling around at them all, now that we are all fed and watered, humph, said Hermione, I must once more ask for your attention while I give out a few notices. Mr. Filch, the caretaker, has asked me to tell you that the list of objects forbidden inside the castle has this year been extended to including screaming yo-yos, fanged frisbees, and ever-bashing boomerangs. The full list comprises some 437 items, I believe, and can be viewed in Mr. Filch's office if anybody would like to check it. The corners of Dumbledore's mouth twitched. He continued, as ever, I would like to remind you all that the forest on the grounds is out of bounds to students, as is the village of Hogsmeade to all below third year. It is also my painful duty to inform you that the Inter-House Quidditch Cup will not take place this year. What? Harry gasped. He looked around at Fred and George, his fellow members of the Quidditch team. They were mouthing soundlessly at Dumbledore, apparently too appalled to speak. Dumbledore went on. This is due to an event that will be starting in October and continuing throughout the school year, taking up much of the teacher's time and energy, but I am sure you will all enjoy it immensely. I have great pleasure in announcing that this year at Hogwarts, but at that moment there was a deafening rumble of thunder and the doors of the Great Hall banged open. A man stood in the doorway leaning upon a long staff, shrouded in black traveling cloak. Every head in the Great Hall swiveled toward the strangers. Suddenly, brightly illuminated by a fork of lightning that flashed across the ceiling, he lowered his hood, shook out a long mane of grizzled dark gray hair, then began to walk up toward the teacher's table. A dull clunk echoed through the hall on his every other step. He reached the end of the top table, turned right, and limped heavily toward Dumbledore. Another flash of lightning crossed the ceiling. Hermione gasped. The lightning had thrown the man's face into a sharp relief, and it was a face unlike any Harry had ever seen. It looked as though it had been carved out of weathered wood by someone who had only the vaguest idea of what human faces are supposed to look like, and was none too skilled with a chisel. Every inch of skin seemed to be scarred. The mouth looked like a diagonal gash, and a large chunk of the nose was missing, but it was the man's eyes that made him frightening. One of them was small, dark, and beady. The other was large, round as a coin, and vivid electric blue. The blue eye was moving ceaselessly without blinking, and was rolling up, down, and from side to side, quite independently of the normal eye, and then it rolled right over, pointing into the back of the man's head, so that all they could see was whiteness. The stranger reached Dumbledore. He stretched out a hand that was as badly scarred as his face, and Dumbledore shook it, muttering words Harry couldn't hear. He seemed to be making some inquiry of the stranger, who shook his hand unsmilingly and replied in an undertone. Dumbledore nodded and gestured the man to the empty seat on his right-hand side. Sounds to me like this might be some Mad-Eye. 'Cause weren't they just talking about that at the Burrow? The stranger sat down, shook his mane of dark gray hair, out of his face, pulled a plate of sausages toward him, raised it to what was left of his nose, and sniffed it. He then took a small knife out of his pocket, speared a sausage on the end of it, and began to eat. His normal eye was fixed upon the sausages, but the blue eye was still darting restlessly around in its socket, taking in the hall and the students. May I introduce our new defense against the dark arts teacher? Said Dumbledore brightly into the silence. Professor Moody. It was usual for new staff members to be greeted with applause, but none of the staff or students clapped except Dumbledore and Hagrid, who both put their hands together and applauded. But the sound echoed dismally into the silence, and they stopped fairly quickly. Everyone else seemed too transfixed by Moody's bizarre appearance to do more than stare at him. Moody, Harry muttered to Ron. Mad-Eye Moody? The one your dad went to help this morning? Must be, said Ron in a low, odd voice. What happened to him? Hermione whispered. What happened to his face? Dunno, Ron whispered back, watching Moody with fascination. Moody seemed totally indifferent to his less than warm welcome. Ignoring the jug of pumpkin juice in front of him, he reached again into his traveling cloak, pulled out a hip flask, and took a long draught from it. As he lifted his arm to drink, his cloak was pulled a few inches from the ground, and Harry saw, below the table, several inches of carved wooden leg, ending in a clawed foot. Dumbledore cleared his throat. As I was saying, he said, smiling at the sea of students before him, all of whom were still gazing transfixed at Mad-Eye Moody. We are to have the honor of hosting a very exciting event over the coming months, an event that has not been held for over a century. It is my very great pleasure to inform you that the Triwizard Tournament will be taking place at Hogwarts this year. You're joking, said Fred Weasley loudly. The tension that had filled the hall ever since Moody's arrival suddenly broke. Nearly everyone laughed, and Dumbledore chuckled appreciatively. I am not joking, Mr. Weasley, he said, though now that you mention it, I did hear an excellent one over the summer about a troll, a hag, and a leprechaun who all go into a bar. Professor McGonagall cleared her throat loudly. But maybe this is not the time. No, said Dumbledore. Where was I? Ah, yes, the Triwizard Tournament. Well, some of you will not know what this tournament involves, so I hope those who do know will forgive me for giving a short explanation and allow their attention to wander freely. The Triwizard Tournament was first established some 700 years ago as a friendly competition between the three largest European schools of wizardry, Hogwarts, Beauxbaton, and Durmstrang. A champion was selected to represent each school, and the three champions competed in 3 magical tasks. The schools took it in turns to host the tournament once every 5 years, and it was generally agreed to be a most excellent way of establishing ties between young witches and wizards of different nationalities, until, that is, the death toll mounted so high that the tournament was discontinued. Death toll? Hermione whispered, looking alarmed. But her anxiety did not seem to be shared by the majority of students in the hall. Many of them were whispering excitedly to one another, and Harry himself was far more interested in hearing about the tournament than in worrying about deaths that had happened hundreds of years ago. There have been several attempts over the centuries to reinstate the tournament, Dumbledore continued, none of which has been very successful. However, our own departments of International Magical Cooperation and Magical Games and Sports have decided the time is ripe for another attempt. We have worked hard over the summer to ensure that this time no champion will find himself or herself in mortal danger. The heads of Beauxbaton and Durmstrang will be arriving with their short-listed contenders in October, and the selection of the 3 champions will take place at Halloween. An impartial judge will decide which students are most worthy to compete for the Triwizard Cup, the glory of their school, and 1,000 galleons personal prize money. I'm going for it, Fred Weasley hissed down the table, his face lit with enthusiasm at the prospect of such glory and riches. He was not the only person who seemed to be visualizing himself as a Hogwarts champion. At every house table, Harry could see people either gazing raptly at Dumbledore or else whispering fervently to their neighbors. But then Dumbledore spoke again, and the hall quieted once more. Eager though I know all of you will be to bring the Triwizard Cup to Hogwarts, he said, the heads of the participating schools, along with the Ministry of Magic, have agreed to impose an age restriction on contenders this year. Only students who are of age, that is to say, 17 years or older, will be allowed to put forward their names for consideration. This, Dumbledore raised his voice slightly, for several people had made noises of outrage at these words, and the Weasley twins were suddenly looking furious, is a measure we feel is necessary given that the tournament tasks will still be difficult and dangerous. Whatever precautions we take, and it is highly unlikely that students below 6th and 7th year will be able to cope with them, I will personally be ensuring that no underage student hoodwinks our impartial judge into making them Hogwarts champion. His light blue eyes twinkled as they flickered over Fred and George's mutinous faces. I therefore beg you not to waste your time submitting yourself if you are under 17. The delegations from Beauxbaton and Durmstrang will be arriving in October and remaining with us for the greater part of this year. I know that you will all extend every courtesy to our foreign guests while they are with us, and will give your wholehearted support to the Hogwarts champion when he or she is selected. And now it is late, and I know how important it is to you all to be alert and rested as you enter your lessons tomorrow morning. Bedtime. Chop chop. So they're going to have two other schools mingled in with their school. That ought to be interesting to see how this plays out. Dumbledore sat down again and turned to talk to Mad-Eye Moody. There was a great scraping and banging as all the students got to their feet and swarmed toward the double doors into the entrance hall. "They can't do that," said George Weasley, who had not joined the crowd moving toward the door, but was standing up and glaring at Dumbledore. "We're 17 in April. Why can't we have a shot?" "They're not stopping me entering," said Fred stubbornly, also scowling at the table. "The champions will get to do all sorts of stuff you'd never be allowed to do normally, and 1,000 galleons prize money." "Yeah," said Ron, a faraway look on his face. "Yeah, 1,000 galleons." "Come on," said Hermione. "We'll be the only ones left here if you don't move." Harry, Ron, Hermione, Fred, and George set off for the entrance hall, Fred and George debating the ways in which Dumbledore might stop those who are under 17 from entering the tournament. "Who's this impartial judge who's going to decide who the champions are?" said Harry. "Dunno," said Fred, "but it's them we'll have to fool. I reckon a couple of drops of aging potion might do it, George." "Dumbledore knows you're not of age, though," said Ron. "Yeah, but he's not the one who decides who the champion is he?" said Fred shrewdly. "Sounds to me like once this judge knows who wants to enter, he'll choose the best from each school, and never mind how old they are. Dumbledore's trying to stop us giving our names." "People have died, though," said Hermione in a worried voice as they walked through a door concealed behind a tapestry and started up another narrow staircase. "Yeah," said Fred airily, "but that was years ago, wasn't it? Anyway, where's the fun without a bit of risk?" "Hey, Ron, what if we find out how to get around Dumbledore? Fancy entering?" "What do you reckon?" Ron asked Harry. "Be cool to enter, wouldn't it? But I suppose they might want someone older. Dunno if we've learned enough." "I definitely haven't," came Neville's gloomy voice from behind Fred and George. "I expect my grand want me to try, though. She's always going on about how I should be upholding the family honor. I'll just have to—" Oops! Neville's foot had sunk right through a step halfway up the staircase. There are many of these trick stairs at Hogwarts. It was second nature to most of the older students to jump this particular step, but Neville's memory was notoriously poor. Harry and Ron seized him under the armpits and pulled them out, while a suit of armor at the top of the stairs creaked and clanked, laughing weaselly. "Shut it, you," said Ron, banging down its visor as they passed. They made their way up to the entrance to Gryffindor Tower, which was concealed behind a large portrait of a fat lady in a pink silk dress. "Password," she said as they approached. "Balderdash," said George. A prefect downstairs told me. The portrait swung forward to reveal a hole in the wall through which they all climbed. A cackling fire warmed the circular common room, which was full of squishy armchairs and tables. Hermione cast the merrily dancing flames a dark look, and Harry distinctly heard her mutter, "Slave labor," before bidding them good night and disappearing through the doorway to the girls' dormitory. Harry, Ron, and Neville climbed up this last spiral staircase until they reached their own dormitory, which was situated at the top of the tower. 5 four-poster beds with deep crimson hangings stood against the walls, each with its own trunk at the foot. Dean and Seamus were already getting into bed. Seamus had pinned his Ireland rosette to his headboard, and Dean had tacked up a poster of Victor Crumb over his bedside table. His old poster of the West Ham football team was pinned right next to it. "Mental," Ron sighed, shaking his head at the completely stationary soccer players. Harry, Ron, and Neville got into their pajamas and into bed. Someone, a house elf no doubt, had placed warming pans between the sheets. It was extremely comfortable, laying there in bed and listening to the storm raging outside. "I might go in for it, you know," Ron said sleepily through the darkness, "if Fred and George find out how to. The tournament. You never know, do you?" "Suppose not." Harry rolled over in bed, a series of dazzling new pictures forming in his mind's eye. He had hoodwinked the impartial judge into believing he was 17. He had become Hogwarts champion. He was standing on the grounds, his arms raised in triumph in front of the whole school, all of whom were applauding and screaming. He had just won the Triwizard Tournament. Cho's face stood out particularly clearly in the blurred crowd, her face glowing with admiration. Harry grinned into his pillow, exceptionally glad that Ron couldn't see what he could. Harry's having one of those dreams. Because he really likes that girl as well, but he's having one of those dreams where he can picture himself winning everything. Which, there's nothing wrong with that. A lot of people actually have dreams like that, where they've won something or they see something happen that doesn't happen and then later on it's like deja vu. Chapter 13, Mad-Eye Moody. The storm had blown itself out by the following morning. Though the ceiling in the great hall was still gloomy, heavy clouds of pewter gray swirled overhead as Harry, Ron, and Hermione examined their new course schedules at breakfast. A few seats along, Fred, George, and Lee Jordan were discussing magical methods of aging themselves and bluffing their way into the Triwizard Tournament. "Today's not bad. Outside all morning," said Ron, who was running his finger down the Monday column of his schedule. "Herbology with the Hufflepuffs and care of magical creatures. Damn it, we're still with the Slytherins. Double divination this afternoon," Harry groaned, looking down. Divination was his least favorite subject apart from potions. Professor Trelawney kept predicting Harry's death, which he found extremely annoying. "You should have given it up like me, shouldn't you?" said Hermione briskly, buttering herself some toast. "Then you'd be doing something sensible, like arithmancy." "You're eating again, I notice," said Ron, watching Hermione adding liberal amounts of jam to her toast, too. "I've decided there are better ways of making a stand about elf rights," said Hermione haughtily. "Yeah, and you were hungry," said Ron, grinning. There was a sudden rustling noise above them, and 100 owls came soaring through the open windows carrying the morning mail. Instinctively, Harry looked up, but there was no sign of white among the mass of brown and gray. The owls circled the tables, looking for the people to whom their letters and packages were addressed. A large tawny owl soared down to Neville Longbottom and deposited a parcel into his lap. Neville almost always forgot to pack something. On the other side of the hall, Draco Malfoy's eagle owl had landed on his shoulder, carrying what looked like his usual supply of sweets and cakes from home. Trying to ignore the sinking feeling of disappointment in his stomach, Harry returned to his porridge. Was it possible that something had happened to Hedwig and that Sirius hadn't even got his letter? His preoccupation lasted all the way across the sodden vegetable patch until they arrived in Greenhouse 3. But here he was distracted by Professor Sprout showing the class the ugliest plants Harry had ever seen. Indeed, they looked less like plants than thick black giant slugs protruding vertically out of the soil. Each was squirming slightly and had a number of large shiny swellings upon it, which appeared to be full of liquid. "Bubbertubers," Professor Sprout told them briskly. "They need squeezing. You will collect the pus." "The what?" said Seamus Finnegan, sounding revolted. "Pus, Finnegan, pus," said Professor Sprout, "and it's extremely valuable, so don't waste it. You will collect the pus, I say, in these bottles. Wear your dragon hide gloves. It can do funny things to the skin when undiluted. Bubbertuber pus." Squeezing the Bubbertubers was disgusting, but oddly satisfying. As each swelling was popped, a large amount of thick yellowish-green liquid burst forth, which smelled strongly of petrol. They caught it in the bottles and Professor Sprout had indicated, and by the end of the lesson had collected several pints. "This will keep Madame Pomfrey happy," said Professor Sprout, stoppering the last bottle with a cork. "An excellent remedy for the more stubborn forms of acne, Bubbertubber pus, should stop students resorting to desperate measures to rid themselves of pimples. Like poor Eloise Midgen," said Hannah Abbott, a Hufflepuff, in a hushed voice. She tried to curse hers off. "Oh, so, they're literally learning in school, but yet while they're learning this stuff in school, it's actually going to a good use. So it's going to, the medical wing in the school, which is kind of cool, actually, to think about." "Silly girl," said Professor Sprout, shaking her head, but Madame Pomfrey fixed her nose back on in the end. A booming bell echoed from the castle across the wet ground, signaling the end of the lesson, and the class separated, the Hufflepuffs climbing the stone steps for Transfiguration, and the Gryffindors heading in the other direction, down the sloping lawn toward Hagrid's small wooden cabin, which stood on the edge of the Forbidden Forest. Hagrid was standing outside his hut, one hand on the collar of his enormous black boarhound, Fang. There were several open wooden crates on the ground at his feet, and Fang was whimpering and straining at his collar, apparently keen to investigate the contents more closely. As they drew nearer, an odd rattling noise reached their ears, punctuated by what sounded like minor explosions. "Mornin'," Hagrid said, grinning at Harry, Ron, and Hermione. "Better wait for the Slytherins. They won't want to miss this. Blast-ended scroots." "Come again?" said Ron. Hagrid pointed down at the crates. "Ugh," squealed Lavender Brown, jumping backward. Just about summed up the blast-ended scroots in Harry's opinion. They look like deformed, shell-less lobsters, horribly pale and slimy-looking, with legs sticking out in every odd places, and no visible heads. There were about 100 of them in each crate, and each about 6 inches long, crawling over one another, bumping blindly into the sides of the boxes. They were giving off a very powerful smell of rotting fish. Every now and then, sparks would fly out of the end of a scroot, and with a small foot, it would be propelled forward several inches. So it farted its way. It farted and flew. That's what happened. only just hatched," said Hagrid proudly, "so you'll be able to raise them yourselves. Thought we'd make a bit of a project of it." "And why would we want to raise them?" said a cold voice. The Slytherins had arrived. The speaker was Draco Malfoy. Crabbe and Goyle were chuckling appreciatively at his words. Hagrid looked stumped at the question. "I mean, what do they do?" asked Malfoy. "What is the point of them?" Hagrid opened his mouth, apparently thinking hard. There was a few seconds' pause, then he said roughly, "That's next lesson, Malfoy. You're just feeding them today. Now you'll want to try on a few different things. I've never had 'em before. Not sure what they'll go for. I got eggs and frog livers and a bit of grass snake. Just try 'em out with a bit of each." "First pus and now this," muttered Seamus. Nothing but deep affection for Hagrid could have made Harry, Ron, and Hermione pick up squelchy handfuls of frog liver and lower them into the crates to tempt the blast-ended Scroots. Harry couldn't suppress a suspicion that the whole thing was entirely pointless because the Scroots didn't seem to have mouths. "Ouch!" yelled Dean Thomas after about 10 minutes. "It got me." Hagrid hurried over to him, looking anxious. "Its end exploded," said Dean angrily, showing Hagrid a burn on his hand. "Ah, yeah, that can happen when they blast off," said Hagrid, nodding. "Ah," said Lavender Brown again. "Ah, Hagrid, what's that pointy thing on it?" "Ah, some of 'em have got stings," said Hagrid enthusiastically. Lavender quickly withdrew her hand from the box. "I reckon they're the males. The females got sort of sucker things on their bellies. I think they might be to suck blood." "Well, I can certainly see why we're trying to keep them alive," said Malfoy sarcastically. "Who wouldn't want pets that can burn, sting, and bite all at once?" "Just because they're not very pretty, it doesn't mean they're not useful," Hermione snapped. Dragon blood's amazingly magical, but you wouldn't want a dragon for a pet, would you?" Harry and Ron grinned at Hagrid, who gave them a furtive smile from behind his bushy beard. Hagrid would have liked nothing better than a pet dragon, as Harry, Ron, and Hermione knew only too well. He had owned one for a brief period during their first year, a vicious Norwegian ridgeback by the name of Norbert. Hagrid simply loved monstrous creatures. The more lethal, the better. "Well, at least the Scroots are small," said Ron as they made their way back up to the castle for lunch an hour later. "They are now," said Hermione in an exasperated voice. "But once Hagrid's found out what they eat, I expect they'll be 6 feet long." "Well, that won't matter if they turn out to cure sicknesses or something, will it?" said Ron, grinning slyly at her. "You know perfectly well I only said that to shut Malfoy up," said Hermione. "As a matter of fact, I think he's right. The best thing to do would be to stamp on the lot of them before they start attacking us." They sat down at the Gryffindor table and helped themselves to lamb chops and potatoes. Hermione began to eat so fast that Harry and Ron stared at her. Is this the new stand on Elf, right?" said Ron. "You're going to make yourself puke instead." "No," said Hermione with as much dignity as she could muster, with her mouth bulging with sprouts. "I just want to get to the library." "What?" said Ron in disbelief. "Hermione, it's the first day back. We haven't even got homework yet." Hermione shrugged and continued to shovel down her food as though she had not eaten for days. Then she leapt to her feet, said, "See you at dinner," and departed at high speed. Oh boy, what's up her sleeve? When the bell rang to signal the start of afternoon lessons, Harry and Ron set off for North Tower, where at the top of a lightly spiraling staircase a silver stepladder led to a circular trapdoor in the ceiling and the room where Professor Trelawney lived. The familiar sweet perfume spreading from the fire met their nostrils as they emerged at the top of the stepladder. As ever, the curtains were all closed. The circular room was bathed in a dim reddish light cast by the many lamps, which were all draped with scarves and shawls. Harry and Ron walked through the mass of occupied chintz chairs and poufs that cluttered the room and sat down at the same small circular table. "Good day," said the misty voice of Professor Trelawney right behind Harry, making him jump. A very thin woman with enormous glasses that made her eyes appear far too large for her face, Professor Trelawney was peering down at Harry with the tragic expression she always wore whenever she saw him. The usual large amount of beads, chains, and bangles glittered upon her person in the firelight. "You are preoccupied, my dear," she said mournfully to Harry. "My inner eye sees past your brave face to the troubled soul within, and I regret to say that your worries are not baseless. I see difficult times ahead for you, alas. Most difficult. I fear the thing you dread will indeed come to pass, and perhaps sooner than you think." Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. Ron rolled his eyes at Harry, who looked stonily back. Professor Trelawney swept past them and seated herself in a large winged armchair before the fire, facing the class. Lavender Brown and Parvati Patel, who deeply admired Professor Trelawney, were sitting on poufs very close to her. "My dears, it is time for us to consider the stars," she said, "the movements of the planets, and the mysterious portents they reveal only to those who understand the steps of the celestial dance. Human destiny may be deciphered by the planetary rays which intermingle, but Harry's thoughts had drifted. The perfumed fire always made him feel sleepy and dull-witted, and Professor Trelawney's rambling talks on fortune-telling never held him exactly spellbound, though he couldn't help thinking about what she had just said to him. I fear the thing you dread will indeed come to pass. But Hermione was right, Harry thought irritably. Professor Trelawney was really an old fraud. He wasn't dreading anything at the moment at all, unless you counted his fears that Sirius had been caught. But what did Professor Trelawney know? He had long since come to the conclusion that her brand of fortune-telling was really no more than lucky guesswork and a spooky manner. Except, of course, for that time at the end of last term when she had made the prediction about Voldemort rising again, and Dumbledore himself had said that he thought that trance had been genuine when Harry had described it to him. "Harry," Ron muttered. "What?" Harry looked around. The whole class was staring at him. He sat up straight. He had been almost dozing off, lost in the heat and his thoughts. "I was saying, my dear, that you were clearly born under the baleful influence of Saturn," said Professor Trelawney, a faint note of resentment in her voice at the fact that he had obviously not been hanging on to her words. "Born under what? Sorry?" said Harry. "Saturn, dear. The planet Saturn," said Professor Trelawney, sounding definitely irritated that he wasn't riveted by the news. "I was saying that Saturn was surely in a position of power in the heavens at the moment of your birth. Your dark hair, your mean stature, tragic losses so young in your life, and I think I am right in saying, my dear, that you were born in midwinter." "No," said Harry. "I was born in July." Ron hastily turned his laugh into a hacking cough. Half an hour later, each of them had been given a complicated circular chart, and was attempting to fill the position of the planets at their moment of birth. It was dull work, requiring much consolation of timetables and calculation of angles. "I've got 2 Neptunes here," said Harry after a while, frowning down at his piece of parchment. "That can't be right, can it?" "Ah," said Ron, imitating Professor Trelawney's mystical whisper, "when 2 Neptunes appear in the sky, it is a sure sign that a midget in glasses is being born, Harry." Seamus and Dean, who were working nearby, snickered loudly, though not loudly enough to mask the excited squeals from Lavender Brown. "Oh, Professor, look, I think I've got an unexpected planet." "Oh, which one's that, Professor?" "It is Uranus, my dear," said Professor Trelawney, peering down at the chart. "Can I have a look at Uranus, too, Lavender?" said Ron. Most unfortunately, Professor Trelawney heard him, and it was this, perhaps, that made her give them so much homework at the end of the class. "A detailed analysis of the way the planetary movements in the coming month will affect you, with the reference to your personal chart," she snapped, sounding much more like Professor McGonagall than her usual airy-fairy self. "I want it ready to hand in next Monday and no excuses." "Miserable old bat," said Ron bitterly as they joined the crowds descending the staircases back to the Great Hall and dinner. "That'll take all week, that will. Lots of homework," said Hermione brightly, catching up with them. "Professor Vector didn't give us any at all." "Well, bully for Professor Vector," said Ron moodily. They reached the entrance hall, which was packed with people queuing for dinner. They had just joined the end of the line when a loud voice rang out behind them. "Weasley! Hey, Weasley!" Harry, Ron, and Hermione turned. Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle were standing there, each looking thoroughly pleased about something. "What?" said Ron shortly. "Your dad's in the paper, Weasley," said Malfoy, brandishing a copy of the Daily Prophet and speaking very loudly so that everyone in the packed entrance hall could hear. "Listen to this. Further mistakes at the Ministry of Magic. It seems as though the Ministry of Magic's troubles are not yet at an end," writes Rita Skeeter, special correspondent, "recently under the fire for its poor crowd control at the Quidditch World Cup, and still unable to account for the disappearance of one of its witches. The Ministry was plunged into fresh embarrassment yesterday by the antics of Arnold Weasley of the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts Office." Malfoy looked up. "Imagine them not even getting his name right. Weasley. It's almost as though he's a complete non-entity, isn't it?" he crowded. Anyone in the entrance hall was listening now. Malfoy straightened the paper with a flourish and read on. "Arnold Weasley, who was charged with possession of a flying card 2 years ago, was yesterday involved in a tussle with with several Muggle lawkeepers, policemen, over a number of highly aggressive dustbins. Mr. Weasley appears to have rushed to the aid of Mad-Eye Moody, the aged ex-Auror who retired from the Ministry when no longer able to tell the difference between a handshake and an attempted murder. Unsurprisingly, Mr. Weasley found, upon approval at Mr. Moody's heavily guarded house, that Mr. Moody had once again raised a false alarm. Mr. Weasley was forced to modify several memories before he could escape from the policeman, but refused to answer Daily Prophet questions about why he had involved the Ministry in such an undignified and potentially embarrassing scene. First of all, He didn't authorize it. Diggory authorized it. And there's a picture, Weasley, said Malfoy, flipping the paper over and holding it up. A picture of your parents outside their house, if you can call it a house. Your mother could do with losing a bit of weight, couldn't she? Ron was shaking with fury. Everyone was staring at him. Get stuffed, Malfoy, said Harry. Come on, Ron. Oh, yeah, you were staying with them this summer, weren't you, Potter? Sneered Malfoy. So tell me, is his mother really that porky, or is it just a picture? You know your mother, Malfoy, said Harry. Both he and Hermione had grabbed the back of Ron's robes to stop him from launching himself at Malfoy. That expression she's got, like she's got dung under her nose. Has she always looked like that, or was that just because you were with her? Malfoy's pale face went slightly pink. Don't you dare insult my mother, Potter. Keep your fat mouth shut, then, said Harry, turning away. Bang! Several people screamed. Harry felt something white-hot graze the side of his face. He plunged his hand into his robes for his wand, but before he had even touched it, he heard a second loud bang and a roar that echoed through the entrance hall. Oh, no, you don't, laddie. Harry spun around. Professor Moody was limping down the marble staircase. His wand was out, and it was pointing right at a pure white ferret, which was shivering on the stone-flagged floor, exactly where Malfoy had been standing. There was a terrified silence in the entrance hall. Nobody but Moody was moving a muscle. Moody turned to look at Harry. At least, his normal eye was looking at Harry. The other was pointing into the back of his head. Did he get you? Moody growled. His face was low and gravelly. No, said Harry. Missed. Leave it, Moody shouted. Leave what? Harry said, bewildered. Not you, him. Moody growled, jerking his thumb over his shoulder at Crabbe, who had just frozen about to pick up the white ferret. It seemed that Moody's rolling eye was magical and could see out of the back of his head. Moody started to limp toward Crabbe, Goyle, and the ferret, which gave a terrified squeak and took off, streaking toward the dungeons. I don't think so, roared Moody, pointing his wand at the ferret again. It flew 10 feet into the air, fell with a smack to the floor, and then bounced upward once more. I don't like people who attack when their opponent's back's turned, growled Moody as the ferret bounced higher and higher, squealing in pain. Stinking, cowardly, scummy thing to do. The ferret flew through the air, its legs and tail flailing helplessly. Never do that again, said Moody, speaking each word as the ferret hit the stone floor and bounced upward again. Professor Moody, said a shocked voice. Professor McGonagall was coming down the marble staircase with her arms full of books. Hello, Professor McGonagall, said Moody calmly, bouncing the ferret still higher. What are you doing? Said Professor McGonagall, her eyes following the bouncing ferret's progress through the air. Teaching, said Moody. Teach? Moody, is that a student? Shrieked Professor McGonagall, the book spilling out of her arms. Yep, said Moody. No, cried Professor McGonagall, running down the stairs and pulling out her wand. A moment later, with a loud snapping noise, Draco Malfoy had reappeared, lying in a heap on the floor with his sleek blonde hair all over his now brilliantly pink face. He got to his feet, wincing. Moody, we never use transfiguration as a punishment, said Professor McGonagall weakly. Surely Professor Dumbledore told you that. He might have mentioned it, yeah, said Moody, scratching his chin unconcernedly, but I thought a good sharp shock. We give detentions, Moody, or speak to the offender's head of house. I'll do that, then, said Moody, staring at Malfoy with great dislike. Malfoy, whose pale eyes were still watering with pain and humiliation, looked malevolently up at Moody and muttered something in which the words, my father, were distinguishable. Oh, yeah, said Moody quietly, limping forward a few steps, the dull clunk of his wooden leg echoing around the hall. Well, I know your father, old boy. You tell him Moody's keeping a close eye on his son. You tell him that for me. Now your head of house will be Snape, will it? Yes, said Malfoy resentfully. Another old friend, growled Moody. I've been looking forward to a chat with old Snape. Come on, you. And he seized Malfoy's upper arm and marched him off toward the dungeons. Professor McGonagall stared anxiously after them for a few moments, then waved her wand at her fallen books, causing them to soar up into the air and back into her arms. You do you. Don't talk to me, Ron said quietly to Harry and Hermione as they sat down at the Gryffindor table a few minutes later, surrounded by excited talk on all sides about what had just happened. Why not? Said Hermione in surprise. Because I want to fix that in my memory forever, said Ron, his eyes closed and an uplifted expression on his face. Draco Malfoy, the amazing bouncing ferret. Harry and Hermione both laughed, and Hermione began doling beef casserole onto each of their plates. He could have really hurt Malfoy, though, she said. It was good, really, that Professor McGonagall stopped it. Hermione, said Ron furiously, his eyes snapping open again, you're ruining the best moment of my life. Hermione made an impatient noise and began to eat at top speed again. Don't tell me you're going back to the library this evening. said Harry, watching her. Got to, said Hermione thickly. Loads to do. But you told us, Professor Vector. It's not schoolwork, she said. Within 5 minutes, she had cleared her plate and departed. No sooner had she gone than her seat was taken by Fred Weasley. Moody, he said. How cool is he? Beyond cool, said George, sitting down opposite Fred. Super cool, said the twins' best friend, Lee Jordan, sliding into the seat beside George. We had him this afternoon, he told Harry and Ron. What was it like? Said Harry eagerly. Fred, George, and Lee exchanged looks full of meaning. Never had a lesson like it, said Fred. He knows, man, said Lee. Knows what? Said Ron, leaning forward. Knows what it's like to be out there doing it, said George impressively. Doing what? Said Harry. Fighting the dark arts, said Fred. He's seen it all, said George. Amazing, said Lee. Ron dived into his bag for his schedule. We haven't got him till Thursday, he said in a disappointed voice. All right, hold on. I believe we started on 10 today. Let me just double check. Yeah, so let's see. All right, so we got one more chapter to read here. Sorry, Ellie. That cat don't want to play with you. Chapter 14, The Unforgivable Curses. The next 2 days passed without great incident, unless you counted Neville melting his 6th cauldron in potions, Professor Snape, who seemed to have attained new levels of vindictiveness over the summer, gave Neville detention, and Neville returned from it in a state of nervous collapse, having been made to disembowel a barrel full of horned toads. You know why Snape's in such a foul mood, don't you? Said Ron to Harry as they watched Hermione teaching Neville a scour charm to remove the frog guts from under his fingernails. Yeah, said Harry. Moody. It was common knowledge that Snape really wanted the dark arts job, and he had now failed to get it for the 4th year running. Snape had disliked all of their previous dark arts teachers, and shown it, but he seemed strangely wary of displaying overt animosity to Mad-Eye Moody. Indeed, whenever Harry saw the two of them together at meal times or when they passed in the corridors, he had the distinct impression that Snape was avoiding Moody's eye, whether magical or normal. I reckon Snape's a bit scared of him, you know, Harry said thoughtfully. Imagine if Moody turned Snape into a horned toad, said Ron, his eyes misting over, and bounced him all around this dungeon. The Gryffindor 4th years were looking forward to Moody's first lesson so much that they arrived early on Thursday lunchtime and queued up outside his classroom before the bell had even rung. The only person missing was Hermione, who turned up just in time for the lesson. Been in the library. Harry finished her sentence for her. Come on, quick, or we won't get decent seats. They hurried into 3 chairs right in front of the teacher's desk, took out their copies of The Dark Forces, A Guide to Self-Protection, and waited, unusually quiet. Soon they heard Moody's distinctive clunking footsteps coming down the corridor, and he entered the room, looking as strange and frightening as ever. They could just see his clawed wooden foot protruding from underneath his robes. You can put those away, he growled, stumping over to his desk and sitting down. Those books. You won't need them. They returned the books to their bags, Ron looking excited. Moody took out a register, shook his long mane of grizzled gray hair out of his twisted and scarred face, and began to call out names, his normal eye moving steadily down the list while his magical eyes swiveled around, fixing upon each student as he or she answered. That is literally about to be a problem for Hermione, that they don't need their school books. Right then, he said, when the last person had declared themselves present. I've had a letter from Professor Lupin about this class. Seems you've had a pretty thorough grounding in tactical dark creatures. You've covered Bogarts, Redcaps, Hinkypunks, Grindylows, Kappas, and werewolves. Is that right? There was a genuine murmur of assent. But you're behind, very behind, on dealing with curses, said Moody, so I'm here to bring you up to scratch on what wizards can do to each other. I've got 1 year to teach you how to deal with dark. What, aren't you staying? Ron blurted out. Moody's magical eyes spun around to stare at Ron. Ron looked extremely apprehensive, but after a moment Moody smiled, the first time Harry had seen him do so. The effect was to make his heavily scarred face look more twisted and contorted than ever, but it was nevertheless good to know that he he ever did anything as friendly as smile. Ron looked deeply relieved. "You'll be Arthur Weasley's son, eh?" Moody said. "Your father got me out of a very tight corner a few days ago. Yeah, I'm staying just the 1 year, special favor to Dumbledore. 1 year and then back to my quiet retirement." He gave a harsh laugh and then clapped his gnarled hands together. "So, straight into it. Curses. They come in many strengths and forms. Now, according to the Ministry of Magic, I'm supposed to teach you counter curses and leave it at that. I'm not supposed to show you what illegal dark curses look like until you're in the 6th year. You're not supposed to be old enough to deal with it till then. But Professor Dumbledore's got a higher opinion of your nerves. He reckons you can cope, and I say the sooner you know what you're up against, the better. How are you supposed to defend yourself against something you've never seen? A wizard who's about to put an illegal curse on you isn't going to tell you what he's about to do. He's not going to do it nice and polite to your face. You need to be prepared. You need to be alert and watchful. You need to put that away, Miss Brown, when I'm talking." Lavender jumped and blushed. She had been showing Parvati her completed horoscope under the desk. Apparently Moody's magical eye could see through solid wood, as well as out of the back of his head. "So do any of you know which curses are most heavily punished by wizarding law?" Several hands rose tentatively into the air, including Ron's and Hermione's. Moody pointed at Ron, though his magical eye was still fixed on Lavender. Said Ron tentatively. "My dad told me about one. Is it called the Imperious Curse, or something?" "Ah, yes," said Moody appreciatively. "Your father would know that one. Gave the Ministry a lot of trouble at one time, the Imperious Curse." Moody got heavily to his mismatched feet, opened his desk drawer, and took out a glass jar. 3 large black spiders were scuttling around inside it. Harry felt Ron recoil slightly next to him. Ron hated spiders. Moody got heavily to his Oh, yeah, I read that already. Sorry, guys. Moody reached into the jar, caught one of the spiders, and held it in the palm of his hand so that they could all see it. I had to get a drink of water, so I kind of miss where I was at. He then pointed his wand at it and muttered, "Imperial." The spider leapt from Moody's hand on a fine thread of silk and began to swing backward and forward as though on a trapeze. It stretched out its legs rigidly, then did a backflip, breaking the thread and landing on the desk, where it began to cartwheel in circles. Moody jerked his wand, and the spider rose onto 2 of its hind legs and went into what was unmistakably a tap dance. Everyone was laughing. Everyone except Moody. "Think it's funny, do you?" he growled. "You'd like it, would you, if I did it to you?" The laughter died away almost instantly. "Total control," said Moody quietly as the spider balled itself up and began to roll over and over. "I can make it jump out of the window, drown itself, throw itself down one of your throats." Ron gave an involuntary shudder. "Years back, there were a lot of witches and wizards being controlled by the Imperious Curse," said Moody. And Harry knew he was talking about the days in which Voldemort had been all-powerful. Some job for the Ministry trying to sort out who was being forced to act and who was acting of their own free will. The Imperious Curse can be fought, and I'll be teaching you how, but it takes real strength of character, and not everyone's got it. Better avoid being hit with it if you can. Constant vigilance," he barked, and everyone jumped. Moody picked up the somersaulting spider and threw it back into the jar. "Anyone else know one? Another illegal curse." Hermione's hand flew into the air again, and so, to Harry's slight surprise, did Neville's. The only class in which Neville usually volunteered information was herbology, which was easily his best subject. Neville looked surprised at his own daring. "Yes," said Moody, his magical eye rolling right over to fix on Neville. "There's one, the Cruciatus Curse," said Neville in a small but distinct voice. Moody was looking very intently at Neville, this time with both eyes. "Your name's Longbottom," he said, his magical eyes swooping down to check the register again. Neville nodded nervously, but Moody made no further inquiries. Turning back to the class at large, he reached into the jar for the next spider and placed it upon the desktop, where it remained motionless, apparently too scared to move. "The Cruciatus Curse," said Moody, "needs to be a bit bigger for you to get the idea," he said, pointing his wand at the spider. "Engorgio." The spider swelled. It was now larger than a tarantula. Abandoning all pretense, Ron pushed his chair backward as far away from Moody's desk as possible. Moody raised his wand again, pointing it at the spider, and muttered, "Crucio." At once the spider's legs bent in upon its body. It rolled over and began to twitch horribly, rocking from side to side. No sound came from it, but Harry was sure that If it could have given voice, it would have been screaming. Moody did not remove his wand, and the spider started to shudder and jerk more violently. "Stop it!" Hermione said shrilly. Harry looked around at her. She was looking not at the spider, but at Neville, and Harry, following her gaze, saw that Neville's hands were clenched upon his desk in front of him, his knuckles white, his eyes wide and horrified. Moody raised his wand. The spider's legs relaxed, but it continued to twitch. "Reducio," Moody muttered, and the spider shrank back to its proper size. He put it back into the jar. "Pain," said Moody softly. "You don't need thumb screws or knives to torture someone if you can perform the Cruciatus Curse. That one was very popular once, too. Right, anyone know any others?" Harry looked around. From the looks on everyone's faces, he guessed they were all wondering what was going to happen to the last spider. Hermione's hand shook slightly, as for the third time she raised it into the air. "Yes," said Moody, looking at her. "Avada Kedavra," Hermione whispered. Several people looked uneasily around at her, including Ron. "Ah," said Moody, another slight smile twisting his lopsided mouth. "Yes, the last and worst. Avada Kedavra, the killing curse." He put his hand into the glass jar, and almost as though it knew what was coming, the third spider scuttled frantically around the bottom of the jar, trying to evade Moody's fingers. But he trapped it and placed it upon the desktop. It started to scuttle frantically across the wooden surface. Moody raised his wand, and Harry felt a sudden thrill of foreboding. "Avada Kedavra," Moody roared. There was a flash of blinding green light and a rushing sound, as though a vast invisible something was soaring through the air. Instantaneously, the spider rolled over onto its back, unmarked, but unmistakably dead. Several of the students stifled cries. Ron had thrown himself backward and almost toppled off his seat as the spider skidded toward him. That's where Harry should have realized, when he saw the blinding green light, he should have realized that was the curse that killed his parents. Because he recalls seeing the green light, and only the green light comes out with Avada Kedavra. Okay. Moody swept the dead spider off the desk onto the floor. "Not nice," he said calmly. "Not pleasant, and there's no counter-curse. There's no blocking it. Only one known person has ever survived that, and he's sitting right in front of me." Harry felt his face redden as Moody's eyes, both of them, looked into his own. He could feel everyone else looking around at him, too. Harry stared at the blank blackboard as though fascinated by it, but not really seeing it at all. So that was how his parents had died, exactly like that spider. Had that been unblemished and unmarked, too? Had they simply seen the flash of green light and heard the rush of speeding death before life was wiped from their bodies? Harry had been picturing his parents' death over and over again for the 3 years now, ever since he'd found out that they had been murdered, ever since he'd found out what had happened that night. Wormtail had betrayed his parents' whereabouts to Voldemort, who had come to find them at their cottage. How Voldemort had killed Harry's father first. How James Potter had tried to hold him off while he shouted at his wife to take Harry and run. Voldemort had advanced on Lily Potter, told her to move aside so that he could kill Harry. How she had begged him to kill her instead, refused to stop shielding her son, and so Voldemort had murdered her too, before turning his wand on Harry. Harry knew these details because he had heard his parents' voices when he had found the Dementors last year, for that was the terrible power of the Dementors, to force their victims to relive the worst memories of their lives, and drown, powerless, in their own despair. Moody was speaking again from a great distance, it seemed to Harry. With a massive effort, he pulled himself back to the present and listened to what Moody was saying. "Avada Kedavra is a curse that needs a powerful bit of magic behind it. You could all get your wands out now and point them at me and say the words, and I doubt I'd get so much as a nosebleed, but that doesn't matter. I'm not here to teach you how to do it. Now, if there's no counter-curse, why am I showing you? Because you've got to know. You've got to appreciate what the worst is. You don't want to find yourself in a situation where you're facing it. Constant vigilance," he roared, and the whole class jumped again. "Now, those 3 curses, Avada Kedavra, Imperius, and Cruciatus, are known as the unforgivable curses. The use of any of them on a fellow human being is enough to earn a life sentence in Azkaban. That's what you're up against. That's what I've got to teach you to fight. You need preparing. You need arming. But most of all, you need to practice constant, never-ceasing vigilance. Get out your quills. Copy this down." They spent the rest of the lesson taking notes on each of the unforgivable curses. No one spoke until the bell rang. But when Moody had dismissed them and they had left the classroom, a torrent of talk burst forth. Most people were discussing the curses in awed voices. "Did you see it twitch? And when he killed it, just like that." They were talking about the lesson. Harry thought as though it had been some sort of spectacular show, but he hadn't found it very entertaining, and nor, it seemed, had Hermione. "Hurry up," she said tensely to Harry and Ron. "Not the ruddy library again," said Ron. "No," said Hermione curtly, pointing up the side passage. "Neville." Neville was standing alone halfway up the passage, staring at the stone wall opposite him with the same horrified, wide-eyed look he had worn when Moody had demonstrated the Cruciatus Curse. "Neville," Hermione said gently. Neville looked around. "Oh, hello," he said, his voice much higher than usual. "Interesting lesson, wasn't it? I wonder what's for dinner. I'm starving, aren't you?" "Neville, are you all right?" said Hermione. "Oh, yes, I'm fine." Neville gabbled in the same unnaturally high voice. "Very interesting dinner. Lesson. What's for eating?" Ron gave Harry a startled look. "Neville, what?" But an odd clunking noise sounded behind them, and they turned to see Professor Moody limping toward them. All four of them fell silent, watching him apprehensively, but when he spoke, it was in a much lower and gentler growl than they had yet heard. "It's all right, Sonny," he said to Neville. "Why don't you come up to my office? Come on, we can have a cup of tea." Neville looked even more frightened at the prospect of tea with Moody. He neither moved nor spoke. Moody turned his magical eye upon Harry. "You all right, are you, Potter?" "Yes," said Harry almost defiantly. Moody's blue eye quivered slightly in its socket as it surveyed Harry. Then he said, "You've got to know. It seems harsh, maybe, but you've got to know. No point pretending. Well, come on, Longbottom. I've got some books that might interest you." Neville looked pleadingly at Harry, Ron, and Hermione, but they didn't say anything, so Neville had no choice but to allow himself to be steered away, one of Moody's gnarled hands on his shoulder. "What was that about?" said Ron, watching Neville and Moody turn the corner. "I don't know," said Hermione, looking pensive. "Some lesson, though, eh?" said Ron to Harry as they set off for the great hall. "Fred and George were right, weren't they? He really knows his stuff. Moody, doesn't he? When he did Avada Kedavra, the way that spider just died, just snuffed it, right?" But Ron fell suddenly silent at the look on Harry's face and didn't speak again until they reached the great hall. When he said he supposed they had better make a start on Professor Trelawney's predictions tonight, since they would take hours. Hermione did not join in with Harry and Ron's conversation during dinner, but ate furiously fast and then left for the library again. Harry and Ron walked back to Gryffindor Tower, and Harry, who had been thinking of nothing else all through dinner, now raised the subject of the unforgivable curses himself. "Wouldn't Moody and Dumbledore be in trouble with the Ministry if they knew we'd seen the curses?" Harry asked as they approached the fat lady. "Yeah, probably," said Ron, "but Dumbledore's always done things his way, hasn't he? And Moody's been getting in trouble for years, I reckon. Attacks first and ask questions later. Look at his dustbins. Balderdash." The fat lady swung forward to reveal the entrance hole, and they climbed into the Gryffindor common room, which was crowded and noisy. "Shall we get our divination stuff, then?" said Harry. "I suppose," Ron groaned. They went up to the dormitory to fetch their books and charts, to find Neville there alone, sitting on his bed, reading. He looked a good deal calmer than at the end of Moody's lesson, though still not entirely normal. His eyes were rather red. "You all right, Neville?" Harry asked him. "Oh, yes," said Neville. "I'm fine, thanks. Just reading this book Professor Moody lent me." He held up the book, Magical Water Plants of the Mediterranean. "Apparently, Professor Sprout told Professor Moody I'm really good at herbology," Neville said. There was a faint note of pride in his voice that Harry had hardly heard there before. He thought I'd like this. Telling Neville what Professor Sprout had said, Harry thought, had been a very tactful way of cheering Neville up, for Neville very rarely heard that he was good at anything. It was the sort of thing Professor Lupin would have done. Harry and Ron took their copies of Unfogging the Future back down to the common room, found a table, and set to work on their predictions for the coming month. An hour later, they had made very little progress, though their table was littered with bits of parchment bearing sums and symbols, and Harry's brain was as fogged as though it had been filled with fumes from Professor Trelawney's fire. "I haven't got a clue what this lot's supposed to mean," he said, staring down at a long list of calculations. "You know," said Ron, whose hair was on end because of all the times he had run his fingers through it in frustration, "I think it's back to the old divination standby." "What, make it up?" "Yeah," said Ron, sweeping the jumble of scrawled notes off the table, dipping his pen into some ink and starting to write. "Next Monday," he said as he scribbled, "I am likely to develop a cough, owing to the unlikely conjunction of Mars and Jupiter." He looked up at Harry. "You know her. Just put in loads of misery. She'll lap it up." "Right," said Harry, crumpling up his first attempt and lobbing it over the heads of a group of chattering first-years into the fire. "Okay, on Monday, I will be in danger of, burns." "Yeah, you will be," said Ron darkly. "We're seeing the Scroots again on Monday." "Okay, Tuesday, I'll, lose a treasured possession," said Harry, who was flicking through Unfogging the Future for ideas. "Good one," said Ron, copying it down. because of, Mercury. Why don't you get stabbed in the back by someone you thought was a friend? Yeah, cool, said Harry, scribbling it down, because Venus is in the 12th house. And on Wednesday, I think I'll come off worst in a fight. Ah, I was going to have a fight. Okay, I'll lose a bet. Yeah, you'll be betting I'll win my fight. They continued to make up predictions, which grew steadily more tragic, for another hour, while the common room around them slowly emptied as people went up to bed. Crookshanks wandered over to them, leapt lightly into an empty chair, and stared inscrutably at Harry, rather as Hermione might look if she knew they weren't doing their homework properly. Staring around the room, trying to think of a kind of misfortune he hadn't yet used, Harry saw Fred and George sitting together against the opposite wall, heads together, quills out, poring over a single piece of parchment. It was most unusual to see Fred and George hidden away in a corner and working silently. They usually liked to be in the thick of things and the noisy center of attention. There was something secretive about the way they were working on the piece of parchment, and Harry was reminded of how they had sat together writing something back at the Burrow. He had thought then that it was another order form for Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, but it didn't look like that this time. If it had been, they would surely have let Lee Jordan in on the joke. He wondered whether it had anything to do with entering the Triwizard Tournament. As Harry watched, George shook his head at Fred, scratched out something with his quill, and said in a very quiet voice that nevertheless carried across the almost deserted room, "No, that sounds like we're accusing him. Got to be careful." Then George looked over and saw Harry watching him. Harry grinned and quickly returned to his predictions. He didn't want George to think he was eavesdropping. Shortly after that, the twins rolled up their parchment, said goodnight, and went off to bed. Fred and George had been gone 10 minutes or so when the portrait hole opened and Hermione climbed into the common room carrying a sheaf of parchment in one hand and a box whose contents rattled as she walked in the other. Crookshanks arched his back, purring. "Hello," she said. "I've just finished." "So have I," said Ron triumphantly, throwing down his quill. Hermione sat down, laid the thing she was carrying in an empty armchair, and pulled Ron's predictions toward her. "Not going to have a very good month, are you?" she said sardonically as Crookshanks curled up in her lap. "Ah, well, at least I'm forewarned." Ron yawned. "You seem to be drowning twice," said Hermione. "Oh, am I?" said Ron, peering down at his predictions. "I'd better change one of them to getting trampled by a rampaging hippogriff." "Don't you think it's a bit obvious you've made these up?" said Hermione. "How dare you?" said Ron in a mock outrage. "We've been working like house elves here." Hermione raised her eyebrows. "It's just an expression," said Ron hastily. Harry laid down his quill too, having just finished predicting his own death by decapitation. "What's in the box?" he asked, pointing at it. "Funny you should ask," said Hermione with a nasty look at Ron. She took off the lid and showed them the contents. Inside were about 50 badges, all of different colors, but all bearing the same letters, S-P-E-W. "Spew," said Harry, picking up a badge and looking at it. "What's this about?" "Not spew," said Hermione impatiently. "It's S-P-E-W. Stands for the Society for the Promotion of Elfish Welfare." "Never heard of it," said Ron. "Well, of course you haven't," said Hermione briskly. "I've only just started it." "Yeah," said Ron in mild surprise. "How many members have you got?" "Well, if you two join, 3, said Hermione. "And you think we want to walk around wearing badges saying spew, do you?" said Ron. "S-P-E-W, said Hermione hotly. "I was going to put stop the outrageous abuse of our fellow magical creatures and campaign for a change in their legal status, but it wouldn't fit, so that's the heading for our manifesto." She brandished the sheaf of parchment at them. "I've been researching it thoroughly in the library. Elf enslavement goes back centuries. I can't believe no one's done anything about it before now." "Hermione, open your ears," said Ron loudly. "They like it. They like being enslaved. Our short-term aims," said Hermione, speaking even more loudly than Ron and acting as though she hadn't heard a word, "are to secure house elves fair wages and working conditions. Our long-term aims include changing the law about non-wand use and trying to get an elf into the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, because they're shockingly underrepresented." "And how do we do all this?" Harry asked. "We start by recruiting members," said Hermione happily. "I thought 2 sickles to join. That buys a badge, and the proceeds can fund our leaflet campaign. You're treasurer, Ron. I've got you a collecting tin upstairs. And Harry, you're secretary, so you might want to write down everything I'm saying now as a record of our first meeting." There was a pause, in which Hermione beamed at the pair of them, and Harry sat, torn between exasperation in Hermione and amusement at the look on Ron's face. The silence was broken, not by Ron, who in any case looked as though he was temporarily dumbstruck, but by a soft tap-tap on the window. Harry looked across the now empty common room and saw, illuminated by the moonlight, a snowy owl perched on the windowsill. "Hedwig!" he shouted, and he launched himself out of his chair and across the room to pull open the window. Hedwig flew inside, soared across the room, and landed on the table on top of Harry's predictions. "About time," said Harry, hurrying after her. "She's got an answer." said Ron excitedly, pointing at the grubby piece of parchment tied to Hedwig's leg. Harry hastily untied it and sat down to read, whereupon Hedwig fluttered onto his knee, hooting softly. "What does it say?" Hermione asked breathlessly. The letter was very short and looked as though it had been scrawled in a great hurry. Harry read it aloud. "Harry, I'm flying north immediately. This news about your scar is the latest in a series of strange rumors that have reached me here. If it hurts again, go straight to Dumbledore. They're saying he's got Mad-Eye out of retirement, which means he's reading the signs, even if no one else is. I'll be in touch soon. My best to Ron and Hermione. Keep your eyes open. Harry. Sirius." Harry looked up at Ron and Hermione, who stared back at him. "He's flying north," Hermione whispered. "He's coming back. Dumbledore's reading what signs?" said Ron, looking perplexed. "Harry, what's up?" For Harry had just hit himself in the forehead with his fist, jolting Hedwig out of his lap. "Shouldn't have told him," Harry said furiously. "What are you on about?" said Ron in surprise. "It made him think he's got to come back," said Harry, now slamming his fist on the table so that Hedwig landed on the back of Ron's chair, hooting indignantly. "Coming back because he thinks I'm in trouble, and there's nothing wrong with me, and I haven't got anything for you," Harry snapped at Hedwig, who was clicking her beak expectantly. "You'll have to go up to the owlery if you want food." Hedwig gave him an extremely offended look and took off for the open window, cuffing him around the ear with their outstretched wings as she went. "Harry," Hermione began in a pacifying sort of voice. "I'm going to bed," said Harry softly. "See you in the morning." Upstairs in the dormitory, he pulled on his pajamas and got into his four-poster, but he didn't feel remotely tired. If Sirius came back and got caught, it would be Harry's fault. Why hadn't he kept his mouth shut? A few seconds' pain, and he'd had to blab, if he'd just had the sense to keep it to himself. He heard Ron come up into the dormitory a short while later, but did not speak to him. For a long time, Harry lay staring up at the dark canopy of his bed. The dormitory was completely silent, and he had been less preoccupied. Harry would have realized that the absence of Neville's usual snores meant that he was not the only one lying awake. Alright, that is our 4 chapters for the day. We are on page 228. We're leaving off on chapter 15. So that is an interesting turn of events, that now his godfather is coming back towards the Hogwarts area, and he believes that Harry might be in trouble. We also have a Triwizard Tournament happening, which has not happened in any of the other Harry Potter books or in any of the movies outside of this one, this particular book and movie. At least we've never even heard about it until this book. And so they're supposedly bringing back the Triwizard Tournament so that people can, have their fun or whatever. I mean, that's pretty interesting, to say the least. And there's 2 other schools that are coming. I mean, if you've watched the Harry Potter playthrough for the game, the Hogwarts game, there's a school that you meet from a lady in there. It's Uganda, and you meet one of that. We also heard about Uganda in our Harry Potter book as well, but they don't really elaborate or go into detail. Whereas if you play the game Hogwarts Legacy, if you play that game, it goes into in-depth details about Uganda. There's a special Gryffindor character that actually talks about it with you. And you get to learn a little bit more about the school through that. And there's also a couple of quizzes in the game. Like, some characters give you some quizzes and stuff like that throughout the game, that if you don't know a lot of the stuff, you can actually learn it from there. And there's a couple of books, like Tales of Beedle the Bard. Tales of Beedle the Bard is part of some of the questions in the Hogwarts Legacy. So if you've read that, or you've listened to my Tales of Beedle the Bard, and then you play Hogwarts and you get to that student that asks you the questions, you'll be able to answer those based off of that. There's a lot of knowledge to be learned about some of the stuff in the Harry Potter books that we haven't heard before or haven't learned before. I learned a lot of new stuff about the Harry Potter and the magical world and stuff from playing the Hogwarts game, but reading the books over and over again as I have, and especially reading it out loud right now to you guys, I'm actually learning a little bit more about different things that are taking place and different things that are happening. It's like I didn't notice them before. It was just like habit, just reading it and understanding and enjoying the story that goes along. But now I'm seeing more in depth beyond the story as to like different things that are happening, which is, if Dumbledore brought Mad-Eye into the school, Sirius Black knows something else is going on. Dumbledore knows something's going on. Mad-Eye Moody definitely knows something's going on. He's an Auror. I mean, the Auras are extremely valuable magic people. in the magical world. Like they're high, like high value targets, or whatever you want to call it. Like they're extremely valuable people, and a lot of dark wizards go after them or try to get rid of them because of the amount of power that they actually have and the amount of things that an aura can do. So I guess that would be a high value target to dark wizards. But you have three you're going to have three extremely powerful wizards. Two of them are going to be in the school. One of them is going to be in hiding outside of the school. So it's going to be very interesting to see what partakes in this book and what happens that all three of them need to be around the school at this time around Harry and understanding like all of that. And now Harry learned that the green light that he was seeing was from the Avada Kedavra curse, and that's what killed his parents, and that's what gave him the scar on his forehead. But I think later on in the book, we also learn what the scar on his forehead actually entails. It's not just giving him life, it's something else as well. But I think we learn a little bit more about Harry's scar and Harry's pastime, like his parents and stuff, as we get further into the book. I don't know if it's this book in particular, but I do know that within the series, there's a lot more about Harry that we don't know. But that's going to be it for us right now. This is our 4 chapters. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Leave your comments on what you like about the book, what your expectations are, or just anything in general. Leave a comment in there, and we can talk about the book and stuff like that. Make it a little book club, you know. We can talk about it, chit-chat about it. What's your favorite stuff with Harry Potter? What's your favorite, like Harry Potter spell or anything like that? Like, what brought you into Harry Potter, and why do you like Harry Potter so much, kind of thing? I know, for me, getting into Harry Potter, it was something my late grandmother got me into. She had bought the books when they had first come out and got them for my brother and I when we were growing up. And so I have kept them and collected them ever since. So I have all of the Harry Potter books. And I do not have the side ones. Like I do have one that comes after the 7th book. I think it's Something Child. We'll be reading that as well. It's the screenplay, but we will be reading that as well on this read along for the Harry Potter series. But yeah, so that's what got me into it, and I just like magic. I really enjoy it. I think there's a lot to be said about things that we don't understand, and this is a very, very great story. And that's why I like Harry Potter, and that's what got me into it. So let me know what got you guys into it, what you like about it, what your favorite spell is. I have to say, my favorite spell, I like Lumos a lot. I really do like Lumos a lot. But I like the Transfiguration spell, too. And, I like, as bad as it's going to be, I do like the Avada Kedavra curse. And the only reason I like the Avada Kedavra curse is because it is very influential against dark wizards. It's an unforgivable curse, but in the time when you need it, it is there. Like, it's a very powerful curse, and you have to be willing to accept the consequences of your actions after that. Like, I do enjoy the curse. I do enjoy that spell, but it's not something that, like, I would say, oh, hey, everybody go use that spell kind of thing, you know what I mean? But it's a very powerful spell. I have to look up some of the other spells, because there's a bunch of them that I actually like. That's the only unforgivable curse that I like, though. The only one. And I don't know why I really like it. I just think because of it being so powerful. And the fact that, it is an unforgivable curse, and I'm one to break boundaries. I do like that, just because of the fact that it's a bad boy kind of curse, and they say it's unforgivable, and anytime you tell somebody you can't do something, they want to do it even more. So that's one of my favorites. I don't like the Cruciatus curse, because that one is just tormenting people. You're just tormenting them with pain, and people already experience pain enough as it is, so I don't think tormenting them with even more pain is beneficial to helping you in a battle or a fight. I mean, I guess in the time frame it could be, but I think that one's probably like the worst. I don't really like that one. So we got the Cruciatus Curse of Avada Kedavra, and there's one other one. The mind controlling one. That one can be essential if you get like swarmed or something, or you get like you can't watch your back and somebody comes up behind you. You're able to kind of protect yourself. So that's not really too bad of a curse either. It's mind control, but I mean, it's not my favorite, but it is still a pretty good spell. But I'll look up some other Harry Potter spells and see which ones I like, because I know there's a bunch in the game. I love casting a bunch of spells when I play the game. I just gotta remember what the names of them are. It's whole habit when I play the game that I don't remember all the names, but I do like the transfiguration one where you can transform into another creature like how Professor McGonagall does. I do like that one. That one's pretty cool. But I think that's an anima guy though. Even though it's still transfiguration, it's an anima guy. But I do like it. It is very cool. But yeah, so that's gonna be it, guys. Thank you all for listening. I hope y'all have a wonderful rest of your morning, evening, night, whenever you're listening to this. And I will see everybody in the next read along. Much love, guys. Bye.